17 June 1944, Saipan. The U.S. 27th Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Ralph Smith, comes ashore near the southern end of the island and moves inland. The mission of the 27th is to provide relief to the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, who have battled fierce Japanese resistance since landing here 2 days ago. Clearing Saipan was scheduled to take 3 days, but the island's mountainous terrain has allowed the Emperor's army to dig in and mount a brutal defense. Now, 2 days after landing, the Marines have suffered 4,000 casualties, and the enemy is nowhere near defeated. It is clear to all that Allied intelligence has badly underestimated the number of Japanese on the island. As quickly as the fresh Americans come ashore, they are hustled to the front. The following day, they are thrown into battle alongside the 4th Marine Division and begin driving toward the primary objective of the invasion of Saipan, Oslito Airfield. The battle for the airfield is savage, in large part because both sides realize what is at stake. If the Americans take control of the site, the innermost circle of Japanese defenses will have been breached, and U.S. B-29s will be within striking distance of Japan itself. Accordingly, Imperial forces, though outnumbered, cede nothing. The 27th pay for every inch they take, but by the end of the day, the airstrip is in Allied hands. Meanwhile, the rest of the 27th joins the 4th Marine Division in their push toward the eastern shore of the island. Before the day is through, they reach Majicien Bay, driving a wedge between enemy forces in the south and those in the north. For the next several days, the men of the 27th consolidate their positions and struggle to clear the southern part of the island. Marine Lieutenant General Howlin Mad Smith, overall commander of the Saipan invasion force, becomes increasingly dissatisfied with the Army commander's plodding approach to battle. As far as Howlin Mad is concerned, the clearing of the southern sector is taking much too long. Explanations citing inaccurate intelligence and the fact that the 27th's artillery had yet to be brought ashore matter little. The Marine General wants results, not excuses, and for the moment, his mood matches his nickname. By 22 June, most of the 27th has shifted north to a position between the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, and the Americans begin clearing the northern half of the island. Though it is clear the Japanese cause on Saipan is lost, commanders order a suicidal defense, holding hillside emplacements to the last man and the last bullet. After 2 days of fighting, the Marines are making progress while the Army continues to struggle. The American line is beginning to resemble the letter U, with the 27th at the base. The imbalance is beginning to cause some serious grumbling among the Leathernecks. The Army's slow progress is not due to a lack of effort on the part of the soldiers. Moving up the center of the island, they face 2 serious geographical obstacles: a valley, the hills around which are bristling with enemy machine guns and mortars, and a heavily wooded escarpment that is proving to be an ideal defensive position for the Japanese. Known respectively as Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge, they have thus far remained immune to the tactical designs of the 27th's commander, which seems to consist of sending wave after wave headlong into the maelstrom. Finally, Howlin Mad can no longer sit idly by, and he takes his case to his boss, Admiral Raymond Spruance. Spruance looks past what might be viewed as an inter-service rivalry and sees men dying, perhaps needlessly. He gives the go-ahead, and on 24 June, the Marine General relieves the Army General of his command. Loyal to their commander, the men of the 27th are bitter about the move, particularly since it comes at the hands of a Marine. But Howlin Smith couldn't care less. He is trying to win the war while shedding as little American blood as possible. He would rather have the men angry and alive than see them sacrificed to some misbegotten loyalty to an incompetent commander. "17 June 1944, with the Allied invasion force pushing off the beaches and through the German lines, Adolf Hitler and his top generals gather in Soissons, northeast of Paris. The topic? How best to defend against the burgeoning Allied presence on the continent. Field Marshals Erwin Rommel and Gert von Rundstedt are adamant in their belief that Normandy is lost. The only sane course is for the German army to fall back, regroup, and prepare a counterattack. Hitler disagrees. Despite the fact that shipload after shipload of troops and material are pouring onto the Normandy beachhead, he remains convinced that the main Allied invasion will come at the Pas de Calais, 200 miles east of the actual invasion site. Rather than allowing his generals to resituate their armies, he insists they stay where they are and accuses all who disagree of cowardice and treason. At the Normandy beachhead, the onslaught continues. American troops push inland from Omaha Beach toward the towns of Saint-Lô and Corentin. Their capture begins the process of isolating the Cotentin Peninsula and the port of Cherbourg. Despite fanatic German resistance, by 18 June, the American 9th Division has pushed far enough west to cut 3 German infantry divisions off from their parent unit, stranding them on the peninsula. At the same time, the American 4th Division moves up the peninsula's eastern coast, sealing the Germans' only avenue of escape. What Allied commanders hope will be the final assault on Cherbourg begins on 22 June, when the RAF and Army Air Force begin softening up the city. First come waves of Mustangs and Typhoons, strafing and firing rockets into German defensive outposts. Behind the fighters come B-26 Marauders, medium bombers that swoop in swiftly and are gone before the German anti-aircraft gunners can home in on them. With Hitler's orders ringing in their ears, the German generals throw everything they have into the battle. German Ack gunners hold up under withering attack, knocking down 38 Allied fighters and one of the bombers. The Allies counter with an artillery barrage of their own, silencing the German 88s and allowing the Allied aircraft unfettered access to the German positions. The American ground assault comes just after noon, with elements of the American 9th and 79th Divisions attacking on either side of the main highway to Cherbourg. Near the town of Valognes, elements of the 313th Regiment encounter a pocket of Nazi resistance. What had been a methodical march up the peninsula explodes into a full-blown battle. A textbook flanking maneuver by the American 3rd Battalion shatters the German line. Though the German cause on the peninsula is clearly doomed, the trapped Nazis fight fiercely to hold their ground. 3 regiments of the 4th Infantry Division find themselves in a bewildering nightmare of hedgerows. Bloody fighting moves field to field. The Allied push is, however, inexorable. By nightfall on the 22nd, American troops are within a mile of Cherbourg. The next day, they capture a nearby hill, giving artillery spotters a commanding view of all the approaches to the city. The German commander, Generalleutnant Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, sends word to his superiors that he has spent his reserves and is exhausted in body and spirit, but will obey his Führer's orders to keep fighting. Von Schlieben's commitment makes little difference. By 24 June, the Allies have pushed nearly to the Cherbourg waterfront. There they call a temporary halt, allowing P-47s from England to decimate the remaining German force. On the 25th, a small armada of naval ships joins in the bombardment, pummeling the Germans without respite. On the 26th, von Schlieben radios Rommel that loss of the city is unavoidable. With American infantry all around him, he orders the burning of documents and the destruction of encryption equipment. Down to his last 800 troops, von Schlieben finally surrenders. On the 27th, the city is secure. The only German troops left alive on the Cotentin Peninsula are prisoners of war. Engineers go to work immediately to reopen the port of Cherbourg, which will speed the rate of the Allied buildup considerably. Rommel and von Rundstedt still laboring under their Führer's irrational command, try to find a way to stop the Allied advance without giving any ground. June 17, 1944, the Philippine Sea. Two Japanese naval groups link up east of the Philippine island of Leyte and steam to the northeast. The combined fleet under the command of Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa is the driving force of Operation Argo. The Japanese plan to cripple the U.S. Navy. Ozawa's carrier force will be augmented by aircraft flying from airfields on the island of Guam. What Ozawa does not know is that U.S. naval intelligence has once again given the Americans the advantage. Intercepted messages describing Argo have tipped the Japanese hand, and American submarines posted around the western Pacific have spotted the Japanese fleet. Fifth Fleet Commander Admiral Raymond Spruance orders Task Force 58 to intercept the Japanese before they can attack U.S. ground forces on Saipan. However, the Admiral is faced with a dilemma. His standing orders are to protect the Saipan beachhead. This means keeping Task Force 58 within 300 miles of the island. On the other hand, the lightly armored Japanese planes can reach nearly 100 miles further than their American counterparts. Once he spots the enemy, Spruance may not be able to bring his planes within striking distance. If he plays his cards right, Ozawa will be able to attack the Americans with impunity. Spruance does not sit idly by, however. On the morning of 19 June, his Avengers and Hellcats hit the airfields on Guam. The planes pound the Japanese, destroying aircraft and ripping up landing strips. By the time the Americans are through, the threat from Guam is, for all intents and purposes, zero. Ozawa, however, hears nothing of that. The commander on Guam not only fails to report the destruction of his airplanes, he inexplicably radios that they're currently inflicting heavy damage on U.S. warships. As American pilots return to their carriers, Task Force 58 Commander Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher is informed that the Japanese fleet has been located 300 miles away, outside the range of his fighters. He is also informed that radar has picked up an incoming Japanese airstrike. So he launches his bombers to keep them out of harm's way and sends the Hellcats to meet the enemy. Meanwhile, those aboard the ships of Task Force 58 man the anti-aircraft guns, turn their eyes to the sky, and wait. 50 miles out, U.S. pilots spot the Imperial planes and move in. Overall, the Americans enjoy a numerical advantage, but this turns out to be less of a factor than the skill of the pilots. Since the beginning of the war, Japanese commanders have squandered both men and machines in desperate, often futile attacks. While planes are easily replaced, experienced pilots are not. The Americans find themselves battling men who have little or no experience flying at all, let alone in combat. The Hellcats rip into the enemy, shooting half of them from the sky. The tattered remains of the strike force move on to attack the U.S. fleet. There, things go no better. American battleships throw up a deadly shield of anti-aircraft fire. Unable to avoid the bursting shells, 7 more planes crash into the sea. In the end, the attack is ineffective, inflicting only minor damage. Of the 70 Japanese planes that started the mission, only 28 fly on to Guam for refueling. A second wave of 130 planes approaches the American fleet shortly before noon. This group fares even worse than the first. Between the skill of the U.S. pilots and the accuracy of anti-aircraft gunners, 99 planes tumble from the sky. 2 subsequent strike forces suffer much the same fate. Ultimately, only 100 of 430 Japanese carrier-based aircraft survive what American pilots have begun to call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Despite the overwhelming success, Spruance is frustrated. He knows he has the enemy on the ropes, but his strict interpretation of his orders has kept him too far away to land the knockout punch. By the following day, he can no longer resist and finally orders Mitcher to pursue the enemy. However, by the time they are spotted, they are at the extreme end of his fighter's operational range, and it is so late in the day that the pilots will have to return and land in darkness. Nevertheless, the chance to strike a blow against a helpless enemy is too great to pass up. Mitcher launches the strike. When the Americans reach their target, they find an enemy already reeling. U.S. submarines, under orders to shoot first and report later, have already sent 2 of the 9 carriers to the bottom. Ozawa orders what is left of his planes to the defense. Of the 80 that get airborne, 65 go down in flames. Short on fuel and sunlight, American bombers pounce on the first ships they see, sinking 1 carrier and 3 tankers, as well as damaging 4 other ships before flying off into the sunset. Despite the resounding victory, Spruance is unhappy with the results of the previous day's battle. The attack, while successful, is not the death blow he had hoped for. In addition, fewer than half of the pilots who flew off the day before returned safely. Of those who survived the battle, many lost their way in the night. Still others ran out of fuel and were forced to ditch in the dark waters of the Pacific. Some are rescued, others are not so lucky. By the time recovery operations are completed, the Japanese have made their getaway. Spruance has no choice but to order Task Force 58 back to its station. The Battle of the Philippine Sea is over. For Spruance, that victory is bittersweet. While his pilots have struck a heavy blow against the enemy, his own caution kept them from taking the Japanese Navy out of the game once and for all. Like a gambler who draws a royal flush on a $2 bet, his joy in winning cannot overcome the bitter feelings of an opportunity lost. June 1944, Washington, D.C. In an Oval Office ceremony, President Franklin Roosevelt signs into law the Serviceman's Readjustment Act, the GI Bill. The new law, which has been many months in the making, is designed to help the millions of GIs who will be returning home at war's end to get on their feet and rejoin the American workforce as quickly and painlessly as possible. The legislation was inspired in part by a letter to First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt from a GI overseas. It is an attempt to comfort the lonely homesick men of the U.S. Armed Forces. However, this GI Bill of Rights is also a product of the public sphere. In the days following World War I, young men whose lives had been interrupted by military service returned home to find that their jobs had been filled by others. They had no way of training themselves for new work. Unemployed soldiers took to the streets, demanding a service bonus. With the Selective Service Act of 1940, Roosevelt had seen to it that men who had to leave jobs to fight would be able to reclaim them upon their return, but provisions still had to be made for the millions who had left the country as boys and would return as men. By the beginning of 1944, 500,000 soldiers had already returned to civilian life. With millions more to come, Roosevelt began laying the groundwork for a successful homecoming.
For our returning veterans and for all Americans, which will provide employment and decent standards of living.
Central to the GI Bill are provisions to educate the returning soldier. The bill promises assistance to every serviceman who can qualify for a college education. It also provides for housing in the form of a $2,000 government-backed loan to buy a home. That loan can, at the discretion of the soldier, be used to start a business. While most appreciate the generosity of the law, many lawmakers have campaigned against it. Republicans, still fighting the social programs of Roosevelt's New Deal, refused to support any bill which smacked of social engineering. Some feared that the bill would subsidize the lazy at the expense of the hardworking. A bloc of segregationists objected to government payment to black GIs. Still others feared the influence of liberal college professors on innocent American minds. Roosevelt, however, threw his considerable political weight behind the bill, building widespread and vocal support for it and carefully steering it through the Congress. Now that it is law, the American soldier can rest a bit easier knowing that while his present is fraught with peril, his future is secure. June 1944, QC, Italy. Allied armies find themselves facing the Albert Line, yet another German defensive line in the mountainous center of the country. The weeks of fighting since the fall of Rome have yielded rapid advances, despite stiff German resistance. Those gains go largely unnoticed. International attention is riveted instead on the invasion of France, rendering the campaign in Italy, popularly and militarily, secondary. The Albert Line is little more than a string of pillboxes and men spanning the peninsula, mid-calf on the Italian boot. It is not intended to be impenetrable or permanent. Rather, it has been created as a holding measure. Although the German High Command realizes that Italy is something of a lost cause, it still serves a crucial strategic function. By continuing to contest every hill and river valley, they are tying up vast stores of Allied manpower and equipment that would surely break their backs if thrown into the fray in France. During the week it takes the Allies to pierce the Albert Line, many of their most seasoned troops are pulled off the Italian front in preparation for Operation Dragoon, an amphibious assault in the south of France. Despite the departure of combat veterans, Allied commanders in the Mediterranean continue to push for major gains. General Mark Clark's Fifth Army drives toward the town of Leghorn on Italy's western coast. A port city, Leghorn will be essential to the supply of troops as they fight their way through northern Italy. After securing the city, the Allies will be able to move on Pisa, the jumping-off point for an assault on the Gothic Line, a defense far more daunting than the Albert. Central to this effort is the British Eighth Army, which is driving up the center of the country in the direction of Florence. Their progress is crucial to push the entire front back and to protect the Fifth Army's right flank. They are slowed, however, as they approach the region around Arezzo, where the Germans mount a stout defense. On 30 June, the British come upon German positions miles south of the city and begin fighting their way over the mountainous terrain. It takes 2 weeks of hard combat, but by 14 July, the 8th is in a position to launch a formal attack on Arezzo itself. Within 2 days, the city falls as the Germans withdraw towards the Arno River. By 17 July, American troops have made swift advances along the Tyrrhenian coast, having captured the towns of Pignano, Poggibonsi, and Volterra. The Fifth Army now has Leghorn within striking distance. Allied ships clearing mines off the coast convince Nazi commanders that there is an Allied amphibious assault on the way. In fact, there is no such assault planned. Nevertheless, the Germans begin concentrating their forces just north of the city. The Allied push comes not from the sea but from the land. As a result of the German shift, some elements of the U.S. 34th Division find the going relatively easy. Troops sent ahead to probe German defenses managed to complete much of the envelopment of Leghorn with minimal fighting. 10 miles east, however, near the town of Foglia, the fighting is bitter. German mortar and artillery fire pins the Americans down, and local counterattacks threaten their flanks. Despite their lack of veteran leadership, the GIs hold and soon regain the initiative. Street by street, they drive the Germans from the town and push toward the Arno. By nightfall of 18 July, much of Leghorn has been surrounded, and elements of the 34th prepare for a frontal assault on the city. Allied commanders are unsure how events will unfold. Until now, German resistance north of Rome has been sporadic. They stand and fight for one village while leaving others uncontested. In the Allies' mind, Leghorn is crucial, but will the Germans deem it so? Will the fight for the city be a bloodbath like Cassino or a walkthrough? Either way, the fall of the city seems imminent. Only the cost remains to be determined. Looming in the distance, however, is the Gothic Line. And there is no doubt as to the Germans' intentions. They will test the mettle of the Green Allied troops with a ferocity as great as any yet seen in this war. And once that test is passed, there will be many more to follow. June 1944, Saipan. After nearly a week of intense fighting, the 2nd Marine Division is poised to take the summit of Mount Tapocho, the highest point on the island. Japanese commanders, aware that they will be neither reinforced nor rescued, have nonetheless ordered an all-out defense of the island. They exhort their men to die for the glory of the Emperor and to take as many U.S. soldiers with them as they can. The Japanese soldiers defending Tapocho proved more than willing to make that sacrifice, challenging the Marines every step of the way with banzai charges and suicidal counterattacks. The Marines, demonstrating their usual resolve, have not backed down at all, making this mountain the most hotly contested piece of property on Saipan. By the end of the day, however, a battalion of Leathernecks sits astride the summit, and for the first time since this battle began, they hold the high ground. Although clearing the rest of the mountain will not be easy, it will certainly be less difficult than fighting their way to the top. Meanwhile, to the east, the men of the U.S. Army's 27th Infantry Division, which is lagging behind the Marines to their left and right, are fighting not only to push the center of the U.S. line forward, but to salvage Pride as well. The division's sluggish performance resulted in the replacement of its commander. The fact that General Holland Smith, the man who ordered the change, is a Marine, only makes their discomfort more acute. They face two daunting obstacles, nearly as challenging as Mount Tapocho. A long, curving stretch of land surrounded by a seemingly endless series of Japanese-held hills and mountains known as Death Valley, and a heavily wooded escarpment bristling with enemy machine guns and mortars, which the men have named Purple Heart Ridge. As the battle drags on, the titles keep proving themselves to be appropriate. Day by day, U.S. casualties mount, while those of the enemy soar to ghastly proportions. Still, the soldiers of the 27th persevere, driving the Japanese from their hiding places with rifles, hand grenades, flamethrowers, and sheer force of will. Their persistence yields results, and the enemy slowly gives way. As the month of June draws to a close, they have cleared the valley and the ridge, catching up with the Marines. The opening days of July find U.S. forces making steady progress in their northern advance, while the condition of the Japanese troops continues to decline. Shortages of food and ammunition plague the Imperial forces, but do little to dampen their fighting spirit. Every day, hundreds of Japanese soldiers willingly die defending seemingly insignificant caves or small patches of hillside. A few surrender, but most choose the sure path to glory, death in the name of the Emperor. It is an outlook on living and dying that the Americans little understand nor care for, but one which they must take seriously. Each day, more of their buddies become victims of this Japanese fanaticism. By 6 July, Japanese forces, who have been forced onto a small sliver of land along the island's northwestern edge, mount a final assault against the 27th. Wave after wave of men with little in the way of weapons and ammunition, charge the American lines. It is a last gasp, an exercise in madness that ends quickly, leaving a battlefield piled with Japanese dead. 2 days later, all organized resistance ends and Saipan is declared secure. But the dying is not over. At the northernmost tip of the island, on the cliffs of Marpi Point, Japanese civilians, including women and children, throw themselves from the cliffs to the rocks below, rather than be taken prisoner by the Americans. It is a fitting end to a campaign filled with so much senseless death. The futile defense of Saipan has left more than 27,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians dead. They cover the island, mute testament to the Japanese willingness to fight to the death, even when all is lost. For the Americans, victory is tempered by a nagging question. If this is how the enemy defends Saipan, what is in store for the Allies as they move closer and closer to Japan itself? June 1944, northern France, having broken German resistance on the Cotentin Peninsula and secured the port of Cherbourg, American commanders now look to break out of the Norman bocage into the wide-open French countryside. But rather than rolling up the German resistance in front of them, they find themselves stymied at the city of Saint-Lô. Located 20 miles inland from Omaha Beach, Saint-Lô is the crucial juncture of a network of roads which radiate out in all directions. Capturing Saint-Lô will not only provide the Americans with a crucial jumping-off point for the drive inland, it will severely limit German mobility in the region. The German positions around Saint-Lô are anchored in the surrounding hills. No movement by either General Leonard Giraud's 5th Corps or General Charles Corlit's 19th Corps goes unnoted by sharp-eyed German observers. Time and again, attacks are broken by precise artillery fire and sharp counterattacks. Allied leaders are increasingly frustrated. The invasion has begun to lose steam. Ground commanders are told bluntly, either advance or be replaced. In the American sector, that means taking Saint-Lô and the hills surrounding it, regardless of cost. On 11 July, the assault begins anew. Leading the way are the 2nd and 29th Divisions. Their initial objectives are the hills outside of the city. Commanders hope that if the high ground can be wrested from the Germans, the garrison within Saint-Lô will realize the futility of its position and withdraw, making a bloody street-to-street battle unnecessary. Hill 192, northeast of the city, is the primary target of General Walter Robertson's 2nd Division. The highest elevation in the sector, it has already been the site of costly fighting. As the men and armor of the 2nd push forward, German infantry armed with Panzerfausts knock out the 6 lead Shermans, causing the assault battalion to withdraw. As the Indian Head Division's heavy artillery pounds the German positions, the men regroup for another assault on the hill. Though they have been bloodied, they are no less determined to drive the Germans from their perch. As the big guns lift their barrage, the assault groups once again move forward. This time, they meet with more success. The artillery has opened cracks in the German defenses that the GIs are quick to exploit. Although the fighting is brutal and costly, Robertson's men begin to gain the upper hand. By noon, lead units have driven the Germans from the summit. They now have a commanding view of the Bérangy Highway, the main east-west route out of Saint-Lô. Meanwhile, to the west, troops of General Charles Gerhardt's 29th Division find themselves in a brutal fight for Hill 122, just north of town. Time and again, infantry charges are repulsed by German artillery and mortar fire. By sunset on the 11th, the 29th has sustained over 500 casualties. Again on the 12th, the men of the 29th try without success to dislodge the Germans. They are again stopped cold. Casualties mount at such a rate that Corlett has no choice but to call off the attack. It seems apparent to Allied commanders that the Germans have no intention of giving up Saint-Lô in favor of a strategic withdrawal. In fact, the word has come down from Der Fuhrer himself: hold the Allies in Normandy until the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine sever their supply lines. Many veteran Wehrmacht commanders believe this strategy is foolhardy. Those bold enough to voice their disapproval are immediately subject to Hitler's wrath. Foremost among these is Commander-in-Chief West, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt. On 2 July, he was relieved of command when he was audacious enough to advocate a German withdrawal from Normandy. By sacking von Rundstedt, Hitler has removed the man viewed by many in the Allied command as Germany's best officer. He instead has played his cards in an all-or-nothing gamble in Normandy. If he is wrong, if the Allies can break the Wehrmacht in northern France, there will be nothing standing between them and a wide-open romp to the fatherland. June 1944, Chicago. There may be no more distinctly American spectacle than a political convention. No matter that there is a war on, and no matter as well that the incumbent is one of the most popular presidents in history. Election time is nigh, and the Republicans gather with all the attendant hoopla to nominate their candidate for the White House. On the first ballot, the Republicans select New York Governor Thomas Dewey. The designee, ensconced in the governor's mansion in Albany, accepts what many see as a death sentence with characteristic confidence and a salesman's smile. It seems the man actually wants the job. Dewey could, of course, have avoided running against Roosevelt. A year before the convention, Wendell Willkie had been the frontrunner. Willkie ran against Roosevelt in 1940. In that election, Republicans had actual issues with which to pummel the president: the Great Depression and the looming World War. Willkie lost by 20 percentage points. Since then, Roosevelt has transformed the process of electioneering primarily through the use of radio. FDR is the prototype for a new kind of politician, one who connects directly with the people through the mass media. While he has not eschewed the more traditional whistle stops and parades, he has rendered them largely a sideshow, outclassing a generation of politicians who are either too hot or too cold for the mass media. Wendell Willkie, for example. Faced with a popular incumbent who is a master of mass media, the Republicans turn to the issues. It is an uncomfortable thing attacking a president with millions of soldiers fighting overseas and the whole country sacrificing for the war effort. Party power brokers, like everyone else, profess their loyalty to the president. They admit that FDR has proven himself a master diplomat, moving the United States from the diplomatic backwaters to the leadership of the free world. They also have no complaint about the conduct of the war. On all fronts, the Allies are making astounding progress. The Republicans are left with three issues: their bitterness over the New Deal, a creeping unease that once the war is over, the Great Depression will return, and the fact that Roosevelt is growing really old. It is not the kind of platform likely to carry the milquetoasty Willkie to victory. So it was for Dewey to wrest control of the party from the Wilkians. Wilkieites? Wilkieistas? Dewey sewed up the nomination before the convention convened by calling in political chits and hitting the mainstream Republican hot buttons. Bitterness over the New Deal, fear of a post-war depression, and Roosevelt being really old. So, on the first ballot, the Republicans give the nod to Dewey, saying basically, you want it? It's all yours. Several weeks later, on 21 July, also in Chicago, the Democratic Convention, to no one's surprise, nominates Roosevelt for an unheard-of fourth term. Called by the Republicans the tired old man in the White House, when he receives word of the nomination, he is, in fact, a tired old man in San Diego, heading for Pearl Harbor and a meeting with Douglas MacArthur. Accepting the nomination, Roosevelt promises to win the war and win it quickly. He also introduces the country to his new running mate, a little-known senator from Missouri named Harry Truman. And so the games begin, another of the quadrennial follies that is American democracy made manifest. Roosevelt is acting presidential, hiding his declining health behind a facade of official appearances and orchestrated media events. Dewey runs frenetically around the country, smiling his eerie smile and reminding everyone that he is bitter about the New Deal, fears a return of the Great Depression after the war, and thinks Roosevelt is really, really old. 15 July 1944, Normandy. The fight here, which has dragged on for over a month, has degenerated into a slugging match, with both sides badly bloodied but still standing. And while General Omar Bradley's American First Army remains bogged down on the outskirts of Saint-Lô, the balance has begun to tip in the Americans' favor. And the reason for this shift is twofold. While fresh GIs continue to pour into the sector, their German counterparts have little hope of reinforcement. In addition, the Allied air forces have been extraordinarily effective in isolating the Normandy beachhead and in restricting German troop movements. The focus of the battle remains Hill 122, north of the town. Despite repeated assaults by troops of the 29th Division, the Germans retain control of the vital hill. It now falls to units of General Paul Bade's 35th Division to drive the defenders from the positions they have paid so dearly to hold. After a preparatory bombardment, troops of the Santa Fe Division begin the mile-long push toward the summit. The Germans, as always, give no quarter. Machine gun and mortar fire rain down on the advancing troops. Urged on by their commanders and driven by a sense of duty to their buddies, the men of the 35th advance undaunted into the maelstrom. Slowly, steadily, yard by yard, they claim the hill, driving the defenders before them. The Germans launch a desperate counterattack, but Bade's men are not to be denied. By late afternoon, they gain the crest. Below them lies the crumbling remains of Saint-Lô. Although they now command the high ground, the Americans still must drive the Nazis from the city itself. That effort begins on the morning of the 17th, with 2 battalions of the 29th driving for the outskirts of town. Under the cover of a dense fog, they slip between 2 German companies without drawing attention to themselves. Their luck does not hold. Once spotted, they come under withering enemy fire. The losses are staggering. 2nd Battalion is so battered it can no longer continue, and 3rd Battalion is down to half strength. Major Thomas Howe, commander of the 3rd, assures his superiors that despite their depleted condition, he will push into Saint-Lô. As he and his men advance, the German fire intensifies. Howe is killed by an exploding mortar shell, and their drive stalls just short of the city. By the following afternoon, however, the German defense of Saint-Lô has finally collapsed. While there are scattered pockets of die-hard holdouts, most of the remaining defenders lay down their arms and surrender. The city is in ruins. Whole blocks are nothing more than piles of smoldering rubble. One soldier remarks, "Boy, we sure liberated the hell out of this place." The troops pouring into the city bring with them the body of Major Howe. Draped in an American flag, he is laid atop the ruins of the Church of Sainte-Croix. He had made it into Saint-Lô. July 1944, northern France. Virtually unchallenged, an RAF fighter pilot roars over the Norman countryside, searching for targets of opportunity. He spots a German staff car racing down the road below. He moves in for the kill. Inside the luckless staff car is Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Miraculously, Rommel survives the attack, but is severely wounded and unable to continue his duties as commander of Army Group B. For the Allies, it is an incredible stroke of luck. Rumors of Rommel's demise hearten the men in the ranks of the Allied armies, particularly the British, who were time and again bested by an outnumbered, outgunned Rommel in the sun-scorched western desert. The British troops are in need of a lift. They have been locked in a grim struggle with the German 1st and 2nd Panzer Corps for control of Caen. And while they have given as good as they've gotten, they are very weary. The greatest blow to British morale came on 13 June when the 7th Armored Division, the renowned Desert Rats of North Africa, moved to envelop the German positions in a wide flanking maneuver through Villers-Bocage, a small village 15 miles southwest of Caen. On the outskirts of town, they got the bloodiest lesson yet on the superiority of German armor. A Tiger tank under the command of Captain Michael Wittmann single-handedly destroyed 25 British tanks and half-tracks, forcing the assault battalions to beat a hasty retreat. In fact, the battle for Caen has boiled down to the Wehrmacht's superiority in armor versus the British advantage in artillery. While Allied tanks are unable to punch through the German defenses, German counterattacks disintegrate under the murderous fire from British artillery and naval guns. In order to break this stalemate, on 7 July, the British had tried a different tack. The RAF dropped over 2,300 tons of bombs on the northern outskirts of the city. The bombing was devastating. The 16th Luftwaffe Field Division that bore the brunt of the RAF's attack ceased to exist, losing all its battalion commanders and almost 75% of its riflemen. The assault that followed met with determined pockets of German resistance, but little in the way of a coordinated defense. British and Canadian units entering Caen on the morning of 8 July found little left. The month-long battle had not only shattered the German defense, it had turned the medieval city into little more than rubble. Although it had precipitated a breakthrough, the intense bombing had been both a blessing and a curse. Upon reaching the Orne River, which runs through the center of the city, the British could advance no further. Follow-on units found themselves ensnarled in traffic jams due to the rubble-strewn, pockmarked roads. Although they had finally advanced into the city, they were unable to exploit their success. Now, with Rommel removed from the equation, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery prepares for a final effort to drive the Germans from the eastern part of the city. Codenamed Operation Goodwood, the plan calls for yet another saturation bombing to precede the assault. On 18 July, over 2,000 RAF and 8th Air Force bombers marked the opening of Goodwood with a deafening roar, dropping over 7,000 tons of high explosives on German positions east of the Orne. Following the bombardment, the British 1st Corps, led by the 11th Armored Division, pushes forward to envelop the German right flank. German defenders, stunned by Bomber Command's pounding, do little to impede the initial advance. But as they regain their senses, resistance begins to stiffen. Meanwhile, the Canadian 2nd Corps, attempting to fix the German middle, pushes directly into the southern suburbs of Caen itself. There, the fighting is especially bloody. It seems every building conceals German machine gun nests, snipers, and anti-tank guns. The British and Canadian troops succeed in advancing some 5 miles into the German positions, but fail to break through. By midday, the British assault is spent. The 11th Armored has reached the Paris-Caen Railroad southeast of the city, but can advance no further. Although the British have failed to break through to the Falaise Plain, Operation Goodwood does convince von Kluge that the main Allied push will come from the east in the British sector. Although the Germans are still holding the Americans at Saint-Lô, their reserves in that sector have been steadily drawn east. 8 out of 9 panzer divisions in Normandy are now committed there. Although this fact may be of little comfort to the Tommies being brutalized by the Panzers, history may judge it as a more telling factor in the battle for Normandy than their failure to achieve a quick victory at Caen. July 1944, the Pacific. With the fall of Saipan, Japan's defensive perimeter in the Pacific has been split. And with neighboring Guam and Tinian clearly in danger of being invaded and overrun, it is beginning to appear as if it may give way entirely. Now, as a result of these developments, it appears as though the regime that led the empire into war against America is crumbling as well. In Tokyo, Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the man who more than any other was responsible for leading his country into a war they now seem destined to lose, submits his resignation to the emperor. It was Tojo who, as war minister and the embodiment of Japanese military fanaticism, forced the moderate members of the government to resign, leaving him and those like him to expand the war beyond China and into the Pacific. It was Tojo who convinced the emperor that any talk of retreat from his aggressive policies would incite the army to revolt. And it was Tojo who browbeat the doubters into believing that Japan could match the military and industrial strength of the United States. Now, after 2 years of consistent defeat, he and his cabinet are gone, leaving others to try and find an honorable way out of the diplomatic and military morass he has dragged them into. Elsewhere, the Americans are not letting politics interfere with the work they have left to do. For more than 2 weeks, the Navy has been pounding enemy positions on the island of Guam in preparation for an amphibious assault. Originally scheduled for 18 June, the landing was delayed while Task Force 58 drove off the Japanese fleet in what is now being called the Battle of the Philippine Sea. When the battle became a rout, the Navy put the extra time to good use. They have pounded the island incessantly, intent on decimating and demoralizing the 18,000 Japanese troops holed up there. Finally, on 21 July, the barrage lets up and the Marines move in. It is a two-pronged attack, with amphibious landings on either side of the Oroti Peninsula. To the north, the men of the 3rd Marine Division assault the crescent-shaped beach that lies between Asan and Adelap Points. 5 miles to the south, just below the peninsula, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade storms ashore, with the Army's 77th Infantry Division saddled up and ready to move in right behind them. Initially, both forces meet light resistance. It seems as though the Navy's prolonged punishment has done the trick. The commander in charge of the barrage, Rear Admiral Richard Close-In Connolly, had said his aim was to get the troops ashore standing up, and while they aren't exactly at attention, neither are they pinned to the sand. However, it is when they begin to move inland that Guam's ugly secret reveals itself. Up and down the coast, the beaches are backed by steep hills and mountains, and the Japanese troops who have survived the naval barrage are in perfect position to vent their rage on the invaders. Things are particularly difficult in the north, where the 3rd Marine Division faces steep cliffs pocked with caves. Artillery and machine gun fire rain down on the Americans as they try to move inland, over terrain that would be difficult to traverse even without hot metal raining down on them. To the south, the geography is less formidable. However, the resistance is no less fierce. Japanese soldiers, some of them down to their last bullet or hand grenade, consistently choose death over surrender and, in their desperation, are surprisingly effective in inflicting casualties on the Americans. The fighting continues for several days, and the progress of the U.S. troops, while steady, is slow. By the 23rd, it is clear that connecting the two forces and securing the island will not be as easy or quick as the Americans had hoped. The Japanese, isolated and facing almost certain defeat, have survived one of the longest and most intense naval bombardments in history, only to strike back with a ferociousness that has left their attackers stunned. And while the Americans continue to make progress, one thing is becoming clear. Though it may be breathing its last in Tokyo, Japanese military fanaticism is alive and well on the island of Guam. July 1944, Leghorn, Italy. As dawn breaks, General Mark Clark's Fifth Army launches an attack on this crucial port city. The plan to wrest Leghorn from German control has been carefully executed, and much of the city is already surrounded by Allied troops. The methodical approach pays dividends, as the soldiers are confronted with only a weak German rear guard. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's forces have slipped out the north side of town, leaving the Allied troops to be greeted by cheering Italian civilians. Further into the city, however, the Allied troops find the Nazis have prepared Leghorn for their arrival. Booby traps are everywhere. Soldiers find explosives attached to chocolate bars, wallets, and bottles of wine lying in plain sight. The streets are laced with anti-personnel and anti-vehicle mines. The Allies make their way toward the harbor, entering what the Italians call the Black Zone. It is so named because the Nazis have cleared out all the civilians, toppled the buildings, and mined the rubble. Fifth Army engineers know that it will be weeks before the roads of the Black Zone will provide safe service to the harbor. Worse, however, is the harbor itself. The Nazis have rendered it all but useless, blocking its passages with scuttled ships and damaging all of the port's 82 berths. Additionally, the adjacent streets have been cratered and all its bridges destroyed. If the Fifth Army is to advance beyond the nearby Arno River, it will need a fully functional harbor to supply the drive. Engineers get to work immediately. Meanwhile, from high ground northeast of Leghorn, the Allies can see their next objective, Pisa, and its famous Leaning Tower. The ancient city is situated in the center of a broad plain and is bisected by the Arno River. Transiting the valley, which is crisscrossed with canals, will be difficult. While retreating along Highway 1, the Germans have demolished bridges crossing these canals in hopes of slowing the U.S. approach. On 20 July, elements of the 34th Division set out for Pisa. Progress is easier than expected. Some of the German demolition efforts have been ineffective. Troops succeed in capturing one bridge before it is blown, removing over 700 pounds of explosives from beneath the span. They reach the outskirts of Pisa on 21 July and spend the next day deploying for an assault on the city. During the night of 22 July, U.S. troops managed to fight their way into the southern portion of town, forcing the Germans to retreat. By the next evening, the 34th holds the south bank of the Arno from the coast to about 10 miles east of Pisa. The Nazis, however, make holding those positions terribly costly, targeting the shoreline with incessant artillery and sniper fire. So accurate are the bombardments, it is thought that Kesselring's troops are using the tower for artillery spotting. Commanders under Clark request permission to shell the tower, but permission to destroy an irreplaceable architectural marvel is not his to give. Allied policy specifically prohibits such an act. Clark and his men find themselves wondering if the Germans are using the icons of Western civilization as a shield. If they have chosen Pisa, not because of its military advantage, but because their presence there will force the Allies to destroy something unique and beautiful. So, despite the killing artillery, the Allies wait and wonder. The tower, for now, will not fall. It will continue simply to lean, in hopes that the war will pass it by. "21 July 1944, Rostenburg, Germany. Hitler predicted his Third Reich would last 1,000 years. But after barely a decade, there's evidence that his regime is disintegrating from within. Radio reports indicate that some of the Nazi leader's most trusted officers have made an attempt on his life. The attempt came during a morning staff meeting as Hitler and his brain trust huddled over maps in a barracks at Wolfschanze, the Fuhrer's East Prussian hideaway. Among those gathered around the table was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated veteran of the North Africa campaign. Having lost an arm and eye in the battle, Stauffenberg came back to Germany to serve as Chief of Staff of the Army Reserve. But as time passed, Stauffenberg, a true military man devoted to his country rather than the Nazi Party, began to believe that Hitler was leading Germany down the road to ruin. And he was not alone. Hundreds of high-ranking officers from every branch of the German armed forces had begun to express the same sentiment in hushed voices. Even the Desert Fox, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, while declining participation, gave tacit approval to the plot to overthrow the Nazis. The meeting began at 12:30 with the participants gathering around a large oak table in the center of the room. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase just 6 feet from Hitler and stepped outside to wait. The blast left the barracks a twisted, smoking wreck. Several of the occupants were killed, but Hitler was not among them, the heavy oak table having shielded him from the force of the blast. He appears later at a train station where he greets deposed Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Slightly dazed, and with his right arm in a sling, the Nazi leader is bruised but still very much alive. The coup has failed, and already the wheels are turning to make the conspirators pay for their deed. July 1944, northern France. After a costly fight, the strategic road center of Saint-Lô is finally in American hands. For General Omar Bradley, the victory is bittersweet. His American First Army is paid to the tune of 40,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. It is a high price for a bombed-out city and a total gain of 7 miles. Bradley's attention now turns to Operation Cobra, upon which he is staking much. The plan calls for the First Army to break out of its position in a massive attack along the road running from Saint-Lô to Perrier, 15 miles to the west. Bradley's timetable called for Cobra to begin today, but heavy rains and supply problems force him to delay the attack. After a postponement of 6 days, Operation Cobra finally launches on 24 July and almost immediately runs into trouble. The attack is to be preceded by a massive aerial bombardment, but again, the weather deals Bradley a bad hand. Although the 2,000 bombers are told to turn back, 400 do not hear the order and deliver their bombs. Cloud cover and human error combine to produce tragedy. Many of the bombs fall on Allied troops, killing 25 and wounding more than 100. The tragic mistake is repeated on the 25th, as 111 men of the 30th Division are killed by misguided bombs. Despite the calamity, Bradley orders the attack to begin. The 2nd Armored Division leads the way, penetrating the enemy's main line of defense and mauling the once elite Panzer-Lehr Division. Behind the tanks, 3 infantry divisions move in to secure the corridor. By the evening of the 26th, Bradley's troops have advanced 3 miles against stiff resistance from German infantry and artillery units. To keep the enemy off balance, 1st Army artillery battalions are ordered to fire through the night. By 28 July, it is clear that Bradley's plan, despite incredible setbacks, has worked. Fighting in the center of the front, the 1st Army's 7th Corps has advanced 16 miles south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road. To the right of the 7th Corps, near the coast, Major General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps is just past Coutances, 11 miles beyond the Cobra's starting line. To the east is Major General Leonard Giraud's 5th Corps. They keep a watchful eye on the Germans for any move that might threaten Cobra's left flank. Alarmed by the American blitzkrieg, the Germans shift reinforcements to the front from southern France. Despite this, Allied commanders remain confident in their ability to exploit Cobra's success, for they are about to unleash an army under the command of a general whose name strikes fear in the hearts of the Germans: George S. Patton. July 1944, Poland. German forces of Army Group Center, who for more than a month have been reeling under the weight of the Soviet summer offensive, manage for the moment to stop the Russian onslaught and re-establish their line along the Vistula River. This sudden halt is a matter of considerable debate in the Allied camp. As the Russians rest on the west bank of the Vistula, on the east bank, the Polish Home Army is fighting the Germans in the streets of Warsaw, determined to greet the Soviets as allies rather than occupiers. The Soviets insist that their offensive is spent, that any relief of the Polish freedom fighters will have to wait until the Red Army is rested and resupplied. The truth of the Russian halt is, in fact, more sinister than logistic. Stalin and his generals, convinced that the Allies will prevail, have taken the first move in the war's endgame. They are more concerned with the post-war status of Eastern Europe than the immediate destruction of the German armed forces. The shift is not lost on Winston Churchill, a first-class endgame player in his own right. He knows Stalin and understands his pathological lust for power. He knows as well that the Russian offensive, which began on 22 June, had, until this sudden halt, been an astounding success. German attempts to stem the western flow of Red Army forces were completely ineffective. The Soviets chewed up ground at a rate rivaled only by the Wehrmacht's successes in the early days of the invasion of the Soviet Union. It is no coincidence, the Prime Minister believes, that the Russian advance has halted so suddenly, with Polish liberation forces fighting and dying within earshot of the Red Army. Churchill is convinced that Stalin has deliberately reined in his generals, giving the Germans the respite they need to crush the Polish resistance, especially those elements loyal to the exiled Polish government in London. When that dirty bit of business is done, the Red Army will no doubt resume its trek to Berlin, taking Poland once and for all into the communist fold. Churchill's pleas to Stalin fall on deaf ears. The Soviet leader remains adamant. The fate of the insurrection lies on the heads of its leaders. In no way did the Russian military sanction the uprising, and it will accept no responsibility for its lot. August 1944, Avranches, France. Waiting in the wings since the invasion began, 59-year-old General George S. Patton finally gets the opportunity to dig his spurs into the fight for France. His new command, the U.S. Third Army, code-named Lucky, is to be the primary tool to exploit the breakout of Operation Cobra. Hard-charging and quick-tempered, Patton is disliked by many senior Allied commanders. The British, in particular, are put off by the brash American. But it is the same flamboyant style that raises eyebrows that makes Patton a crucial cog in the Allied wheel. His battlefield savvy and eagerness to carry the fight to the enemy are assets Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower prizes. If he must at times soothe a few ruffled British feathers, it is a price Ike is willing to pay. In fact, Eisenhower is already an old hand at dealing with Patton's impertinent behavior. In North Africa and Sicily, Patton was in a position he loathed, playing second fiddle to the British Eighth Army and General Bernard Montgomery. It was a disgust he was none too shy about voicing, constantly appealing to Eisenhower that Montgomery and Field Marshal Harold Alexander were hamstringing him so British forces could reap all the glory of victory. Ike pressured Patton to do his best to get along with the British, pointing out that, like it or not, Alexander was his immediate superior. Patton, however, was not one to let a little detail like chain of command stand between him and his self-perceived destiny. Time and again, he skirted the terms of his orders, obeying them just enough to prevent court-martial. At every opportunity, he would seize the initiative and strike out at the enemy. At the same time, he complained bitterly and loudly that Montgomery was too cautious, that his plodding approach was needlessly extending the war. This bravado, while infuriating to the British, earned Patton a lot of ink in newspapers and magazines back home. Indeed, it proved great fodder for a public starved for a hero, an American general who was not only taking it to the Germans, but was doing so in spite of the British. Now, almost a year since the victory in Sicily, Patton again finds himself on the battlefield alongside Montgomery. And while his primary concern is a swift Allied victory, he cannot help but relish the opportunity to show up the British. He realizes that a dramatic drive to isolate and destroy German forces on the Brittany Peninsula will not only bring him and his army great acclaim, it will only accentuate Monty's lack of progress at Caen. So, even as the battle rages, the schoolboy rivalry continues. Each general is certain that he alone holds the key to victory, and that the other is standing in the way of his triumphant march into history. August 1944, La Romola, Italy. British troops under General Bernard Freyberg watch from the city as Allied fighter bombers pummel the hills north of town. This high ground is the last obstacle remaining between the Allies and the ancient city of Florence, less than 10 miles distant. The infantry assault comes only after a devastating artillery barrage. The Germans fight tenaciously, propelling repeated Allied thrusts. As the fighting continues, however, their store of ammunition becomes depleted, and slowly but surely the Brits gain ground. By day's end, the defenders are forced to capitulate, and Freyberg's men claim the hill. Visible in the distance is Florence. 2 days later, as troops enter the city, the Germans offer no resistance. On 23 July, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring declared it an open city and began moving his troops to positions north of town. The fact that the Germans have chosen not to fight in Florence does not save it from the ravages of war, however. The Arno River, which bisects the city, is spanned at several points by bridges, some of which the Germans destroy. Others are inaccessible, the Germans having blocked the streets for 100 yards on either side with the rubble of destroyed buildings. While Kesselring was loath to destroy one of Europe's oldest and most beautiful cities, the bridges are an acceptable sacrifice. Every moment he can delay the Allied drive northward results in greater strength for the Gothic line. A raid across the entire peninsula along the Apennines mountain range, the Gothic line is Germany's last hope for preventing its enemies from reaching the plains of the Po River Valley, where the fighting will become easier and the advance more swift. Planning for a defensive line began a year ago, before Sicily fell. In the years since, thousands of German workers and Italian slave laborers have seeded the fields between the Arno and the Apennines with thousands of mines. They have laid hundreds of miles of entangling wire, scored the foothills with anti-tank trenches, and dotted the hillsides with machine gun nests. So extensive are the preparations that the defenses at points reach 10 miles deep. Allied Theater Commander Field Marshal Harold Alexander's plan for breaching the line relies upon focusing as much of his force as possible on a single point. However, some of his subordinates prefer a two-pronged assault, one aimed at Bologna and the other along the east coast. Alexander believes the idea has merit and, in a meeting on 4 August, changes the plan. Word comes down to the troops that there will be a 3-week respite from fighting. In that time, the Allied forces are to regroup and recoup in preparation for the assaults. While this is a pleasant respite for the men on the line, it poses considerable risk. Every day the Allies wait, the Gothic line grows stronger and Italy's rainy season grows closer. It will be colder, probably raining, possibly snowing, definitely muddy. And the Germans will, for the first time in a long time, enjoy the advantage. July 1944. As the Allies have pushed into northern France, the folks back home have been bombarded with stories about the innovative use of tank-mounted plows in breaking through the French hedgerows. Those plows, impressive though they are just one example of what is coming to be known as tank expedients, improvisations created on the fly to solve particularly difficult situations. Take, for example, the battle sled. Developed on the orders of an infantry commander in southern Italy and designed to be towed behind tanks, the sleds were greeted by the infantry with a decided lack of enthusiasm. The soldiers, it seems, didn't like the idea of being pulled into battle face down. The army, however, built more than 300 of the sleds, and they saw limited use in the breakout at Anzio. As Allied forces in Italy moved northward, they ran into tank obstacles, both natural and man-made. The Germans used the diked streams of the Italian countryside as tank trenches, setting their defenses behind the high levees and picking off approaching Allied columns. To speed the breaching of these obstacles, engineers improvised fascines, bundles of medium-sized logs wrapped around oil drums that can be dropped into stream beds. M4 tanks are converted to carriers by fitting the turret with a special device which can rotate to dump the fascine where needed. To pierce the German defenses, engineers still have to blast through the dikes, but instead of bulldozing soil into the remaining ditch, they simply call in a Sherman to drop in a fascine. In no time at all, tanks are passing over the temporary bridge. The success of the fascines got inventors back in Britain thinking. Though that can at times be dangerous, in this case the results seem to be borderline revolutionary. By outfitting an M4 hull with a folding treadway bridge, the engineers have created what is called an arc. Unlike conventional temporary bridges, the arc need not be set up while exposed to enemy fire. The engineers simply blast through a ditch's protective dike, and then the arc drives into place, its crew safely protected by the tank's armor. The result may not be pretty, but it gets the trailing armor column across the obstacle and back into the fight in a matter of seconds. Less elaborate, but nonetheless effective, is putting a segment of a treadway bridge on a rolling dolly. This has the advantage of working with a fully functional tank, which pushes the bridge into place, crosses without hesitation, and leads the charge into battle. Finally, there is the matter of breaching minefields. The Germans have had 4 years to mine northern Europe, and there is, of course, an invention designed to facilitate the breaching of those fields. The idea is simple. Outfit an M4 with rollers that will detonate any mines they might encounter. The rollers detonate the mines before the delicate treads can reach them. They also mark a clear path for those who follow. Ingenious, and like all expedients, beautiful in its simplicity. And it kind of leaves you wondering, what will they think of next? This war has, for the first time, made commonplace the incredibly complex and dangerous method of attack known as amphibious assault. Nearly every major offensive by the British and Americans has been initiated with a large-scale landing. The logistics of mounting an attack from the sea are almost incomprehensible. Instrumental in getting thousands of men and tons of equipment safely from ship to shore has been the development of myriad specialized shallow draft boats. No less a dignitary than General Dwight Eisenhower has called them the key to victory. Their utility has been limited only by the fact that there are never enough of them to go around. Due to their relative scarcity, these inexpensive little craft are, on the battlefield, more precious than gold. In an effort to extend the service life of every one, engineers have devised a way to service them in the field, a kind of mobile repair shop that can be deployed anywhere needed. LVTs bring ashore 5 6x12-foot skids containing everything needed to repair landing craft. The skids are deployed unceremoniously. Modular in design, each contains its own specialized complement of material for the highly specialized problems of landing craft repair. One skid is dedicated to spare parts. Another is fully equipped to repair damaged engines, complete with large press and full workbench. And the rest of the skids contain everything it takes to repair bullet holes, mine damage, and slipped tracks. There is a blacksmithing and welding station. Another skid holds all the consumable items the shop needs to operate: acetylene for torches, sheet metal for the hull, and all the various nuts and bolts a proper grease monkey needs. Any good service station needs a tow truck, and this one is no exception. Called a retriever, it uses a powerful winch to pull foundering craft out of the surf. Retriever crews approaching burning LVTs can spray 500 gallons of water per minute on the fire. If the fire is petroleum-based, the crew can use its 12-foot fogger extension to smother the conflagration. Once ashore, the wreck is towed to the appropriate workstation and repaired. Metal plates are reattached. Engines are serviced. Holes are patched. Then, after the invasion beaches are cleared, the pallets are reloaded onto their carriages and float off into the sunset, prepared to bring comfort to ailing landing craft around the world. August 1944, northern France. Elation may not be too strong a term to describe the mood of American commanders. After 2 months of bloody fighting for minimal gains, they are finally advancing. In fact, General George Patton's Third Army is not only making headway, it is steamrolling through Brittany. German command and control is in a shambles. Headquarters units are constantly on the move, trying to keep ahead of stampeding American armor. Orders are issued without any real sense of the disposition of forces on either side. The retreat is so rapid that some Wehrmacht units who believed they were well behind the front suddenly find themselves surrounded. The speed of the attack is, in fact, beginning to cause the Americans themselves problems. The difficulty is not due to a shortage of bullets or fuel, but rather a lack of all things, telephone wire. Communication lines cannot be strung fast enough to keep up with forward units. Crucial information is in many cases being relayed by courier jeeps. By the time messages are delivered, the rapidly changing battlefield has rendered them obsolete. While this antiquated communication system keeps the higher-ups groping for updated information, it gives local commanders a relatively free hand on the battlefield. It is an independence they relish. The armored divisions, in particular, are pushing ahead with what some would consider reckless abandon. Their left flank lies dangerously exposed at the town of Avranches, which has become the bottleneck through which all supplies and reinforcements must pass. For Hitler, it is too inviting a target. Always one given to dramatic all-or-nothing operations, he overrides his general's objections and orders the 47th Panzer Corps to counterattack through Avranches and cut off the Third Army in Brittany. On the morning of 7 August, the assault begins with the 2nd and 116th Panzer Divisions leading the way. Initially, they meet with success, quickly capturing Mortain and surrounding an entire battalion of General Leland Hobbs' 30th Division. The Americans, however, do not panic. They fight to hold their ground and wait for the morning fog to lift. When it does, Allied fighter bombers quickly blunt the armored spearhead. By midday, the Germans have been stopped, still 14 miles short of their objective. All the while, the Third Army's advance to the south continues, impervious to the threat to its flank. On the Brittany Peninsula, General Troy Middleton's 8th Corps rolls on almost unchallenged. The Germans have retreated to the vital port cities, determined to hold out there as long as possible. By ceding most of Brittany without a fight, the Germans allow Patton and his generals to turn their attention south and east. Here, too, progress is astounding. By the evening of the 9th, elements of General Wade Haslip's 15th Corps reach Le Mans and begin to turn north. With British and Canadian forces driving south from Caen and Patton's forces pushing north into his left flank, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge realizes that he faces disaster. His entire army group is in danger of encirclement at Falaise. By the 11th, although Hitler still refuses to consider a total withdrawal, German forces around Mortain slowly begin to fall back. The bitter fighting continues for several days, with the Germans desperately trying to hold open the corridor to the east. By the 15th, they are in headlong retreat, trying to escape the quickly closing Allied pincer. They are helped by General Omar Bradley's order for the Americans to halt at Argentan to avoid accidental hostile contact with British and Canadian forces advancing from the north. The eastward flow of Army Group B continues until 3 days later, on the 18th, when the trap finally slams shut. With the closing of the Falaise Gap, the fight for France has shifted dramatically. Fully 15 frontline German divisions have been wiped out. 10,000 Germans have been killed and 50,000 are taken prisoner. Those who were lucky enough to escape did so with virtually none of their heavy equipment. Morale in the Allied ranks soars. The road to Paris and the German frontier lies virtually wide open. There is talk of being home for Christmas, of dancing in the streets of Berlin. To one and all, it seems as if Adolf Hitler's once mighty Wehrmacht has been permanently reduced to little more than a whimpering pup. August 1944, Isle of Wight. Don't let appearances fool you. Here, things are not what they seem. You won't play around with the local golf pro, follow it up with an ice cream cone, or stay in the Grand Hotel. This is no place for relaxation. This is the heart of a military operation, for here starts the flow of the Allied Army's lifeblood. Within these walls are the pumping stations that supply gasoline to Allied troops in France through pipelines under the ocean, Pluto for short. Starting here, extending into the English Channel, and ending in Cherbourg, they are but one part of a massive operation to keep the troops resupplied with the hundreds of tons of materials they need each day to drive back the Germans. Once fully operational, Pluto will pump 1 million gallons of gasoline to the front each day through two kinds of specially designed pipe. The first type is multi-layered lengths of pipe connected together using a flange which forms leak-proof joints. It is deployed across the channel by converted merchant ships, using an apparatus much like that used to lay electric lines. The second type is a 3-inch steel pipe which is welded together in a dockside factory to form 3/4-mile lengths. It is flexible enough to wind around a floating steel drum that looks like a massive cotton wheel called a conundrum. The drum holds up to 70 miles of pipe and deploys it as it is towed across the channel. 4 lines have been laid so far. When Operation Pluto is complete, between 15 and 20 undersea arteries will carry 3,000 tons of petroleum products to the front each day. Fuel supply is not the only logistical problem Allied planners face. One of the most difficult dilemmas encountered in planning the invasion was how to sustain the effort without a port in Normandy. The Germans had heavily fortified all the channel ports, and securing them would take time. Without them, however, the invasion effort would die. An impossible situation demands a creative answer. Mobile harbors, a fanciful idea in 1943 when Winston Churchill declared, "We shall build our own ports and bring them with us," are now, through the creativity, ingenuity, and hard work of thousands, a reality. Called Mulberries, installation of these harbors began on the afternoon of 6 June, just hours after the invasion. Antiquated freighters steamed across the channel to Saint-Laurent-Semier and Arromanches. But rather than carrying supplies to the beaches, they were sunk to provide an initial breakwater for the ports. As they dipped their bows beneath the waves, the next movement in a carefully orchestrated operation began. On 7 June, tugs towed enormous concrete caissons known as phoenixes across the channel. These 60 by 60 by 200-foot boxes weigh almost 100 tons apiece, and once in place, serve as the primary breakwaters for the Mulberries. On 19 June, an unseasonable channel storm pounded Mulberry A at Saint-Laurent-Semier. Nearly two-thirds of the phoenixes and all of the floating pier was wrecked by the heavy waves. All efforts were then concentrated on Mulberry B at Arromanches. Mulberry B's 7 floating piers are linked by 2 causeways nearly 500 feet long, over which equipment can be directly offloaded. It is an incredibly efficient system. A job that would take 3 to 9 hours unloading from ship to beach takes less than an hour from a Mulberry. More than 130 tons of supplies a week pour ashore. And so, although the headline-grabbing battles are being fought miles inland, they are being won on the shores of the English Channel. August 1944, southern France, the 1st Airborne Task Force under the command of Major General Robert T. Frederick lands near Le Muy, several miles inland from the Mediterranean coast. Operation Dragoon, the long-awaited and debated invasion of the French Riviera, has begun. This combined force of American and British paratroops is to secure roadways the Germans will need to funnel reinforcements toward the invasion beaches. The task force meets surprisingly little resistance, and within hours they secure their objectives. Then the men begin the uneasy wait that fills in the gaps in any military operation. Meanwhile, the American 6th Corps lies offshore preparing to storm the beaches. Comprised of 3 battle-hardened divisions, the 6th is supported by an armada of 5 battleships, 9 escort carriers, and 122 destroyers. Using techniques long since perfected for amphibious operations, the invasion is preceded by an overwhelming bombardment from the air and sea. Heavy, medium, and fighter bombers fly over 4,000 missions, pounding Nazi positions. The Navy pumps more than 50,000 rounds into German coastal defenses. The defenders, the German 19th Army under the command of General Friedrich Wysse, are not exactly the pride of the Wehrmacht. Comprised of less than frontline troops, the 19th can only boast 1 division of battle-ready veterans, the 11th Panzer, which is stationed west of the Rhone River. Knowing the Allies would need a high-capacity port to supply a massive effort in France, the Germans were convinced the landing would come near Marseille. The objective was essential for the Allies, and the beaches were ideal for amphibious operations. To the Germans, the 25-mile pocket between Marseille and the Rhone seemed like the perfect place for a trap. With the fast-moving river blocking the Allied flank and the Mediterranean blocking their rear, the Germans figured on pinning the Americans against 2 natural barriers. Weeks earlier, Wysse moved the 11th to the west side of the Rhone in preparation for his brilliantly planned counterstroke. He did not consider for a moment that the Allies would not only land where they weren't expected, but would anticipate his strategy. In the days before the invasion, Allied air forces exercising complete air supremacy destroyed every bridge over the Rhone for nearly 50 miles to the north. The 11th Panzer, the only real hope to repel the invasion, finds itself trapped helplessly on the west bank of the river. They will have to travel north to Montélimar on congested roads, harried by Allied fighters, before they can cross the Rhone and come to the aid of the troops battling the Allied invasion force. There, the hapless Germans await what seems like another inevitable defeat in France. Fighting a series of less than calculated withdrawal actions, the Germans fall back and hope the 11th Panzer Division can somehow, miraculously, pull their chestnuts out of the fire. August 1944, Paris. As the Allied command tries to decide what to do about the German occupation of the city, the French gendarmerie precipitates something of a crisis in the City of Lights by going on strike. That strike, in turn, opens the streets to skirmishing between the French underground and the city's Nazi occupiers. The fighting is a symptom of the French impatience over the fate of their capital city. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower favors a plan to bypass Paris, pushing the Allied armies eastward to the Siegfried Line. Ike has long believed that, cut off from the fatherland, the Nazi occupation force would collapse, liberating the city without destructive and costly house-to-house fighting. Ike's concern for the fate of Paris is not unfounded. Adolf Hitler, in a frothing rage over what he considers incompetence among his generals, has ordered his commander on the ground, General Dietrich von Choltitz, to destroy the city. Paris, the ranting Führer insists, must fall into Allied hands only as a heap of rubble. Now, to further complicate things, von Choltitz is confronted with an insurrection. His troops on the street are fired down upon by guerrillas on the rooftops. Free French commander General Charles de Gaulle, hearing reports of the uprising, pleads to Eisenhower. The Germans have either left or are powerless. The anarchy currently reigning in the streets, what Le Grand Charles calls the disorderly situation, is a portent of a communist takeover of the city. Though there are those at Allied headquarters who believe de Gaulle's obsession with Paris to be more a matter of ego than strategy, his concern for the ultimate fate of post-war France is very real. Many of the underground's most active cells, the very groups leading the uprising in Paris, are dominated by Marxists as dedicated to establishing a communist government as they are to driving the Nazis out of France. De Gaulle believes that if the Allies bypass the city, the communists might solidify their control over it and ultimately all of France. Eisenhower reluctantly abandons his strategy of pinching off Paris and orders Jacques Leclerc's Free French Division to move toward the city. As the French and Americans push forward, they find themselves under vigorous attack. The Nazis have lined the roads with 88mm guns and fire them point blank at the advancing columns. On 23 August, the 88s kill over 300 men and destroy 41 tanks. Eisenhower, hearing reports of the fighting, considers rescinding his order to take Paris and going back to his original plan. Heavy losses or no, the French and American forces pushing toward the city are making progress. The Germans, as they withdraw, are pointedly not blowing up historic bridges and buildings. And in the streets of Paris, the mayhem continues. With few stormtroopers to harass, the underground begins to turn its attention to ferreting out Nazi collaborators and, in some cases, eliminating rival underground factions. Unleashed from 4 years of occupation, they, like the French revolutionaries who freed the country from imperial rule, are growing less concerned with fighting the enemy without and more concerned with purging the enemy within. For Dix, New Jersey. In this place where training of the most basic kind goes on, drill sergeants have long cajoled and cursed their young recruits with an eye toward their future good health. With war raging around the world, that training has never been more urgent. And from the looks of what's happening now, the greatest battle the armed forces faces is not in Europe or the Pacific, but in bed. Call it VD Day if you have to, or the invasion of pants, or, well, but that you could avoid mentioning it at all. Unfortunately, that's not an option. As manpower demands increase on all fronts, the armed forces have been forced into a fairly offensive. Propaganda experts, military police, chaplains, and doctors have formed a kind of combined arms team to stem the spread of venereal disease. The battle begins here at basic training, where young and naive recruits, often having never experienced the relevant pleasure, haunt towns and countrysides in search of feminine companionship. Despite the admirable efforts of the powers that be, near every large military installation, the world's oldest profession responds with a deluge of alternative recreational possibilities. In England, the prostitutes in and around Piccadilly Circus are becoming a very real problem indeed. The local citizenry, outraged by the sexual antics of American soldiers, demands a crackdown. Houses of ill repute are closed, streetwalkers detained, and red light districts placed strictly off limits. However, much to the chagrin of the military, VD rates among enlisted men continue to rise. That's because there are plenty of amateurs willing to take up where the professionals leave off. They are referred to, perhaps affectionately, as khaki wackies, victory girls, or cuddle bunnies. And they are, like the soldiers themselves, ready, willing, and able. The effect on manpower is staggering. Thousands of soldiers and sailors have become victims of the softer side of war, restricted to quarters by wounds inflicted not by the enemy, but by their own urges. When it becomes clear that standard operating procedure is impotent against this terror, the War Department turns to propaganda, using a series of appallingly graphic films with titles like Good Girls Have VD too. This being a no-holds-barred, below-the-belt fight, the War Department also has a secret weapon: latex.
We have set this period aside to get the old rubber in.
The armed forces are dispensing almost 50,000 condoms a month. Doctors do short arms inspections in the middle of the night to ensure troops not reporting their VD are discovered and treated. Once the men get to the front, VD ceases to be a problem. In battle-torn areas, soldiers are more concerned with the basics of survival than the comforts of the flesh. Of course, there are still those R&R passes to worry about, and there always will be, until the war ends and Johnny comes marching home in a rather odd way. August 1944, Paris. Amidst a torrent of emotion, the Free French troops of General Jacques Leclerc's 2nd Armored Division enter the City of Lights. Parisians pour into the streets to greet the sons of France who, after 4 long years, have returned to liberate the capital city. The last vestiges of shame from the humiliation of 1940 are washed away in a flood of wine, kisses, and flowers. Despite the still brewing debate as to whether the city should have been bypassed, no one in the Allied ranks can help but be delighted that Paris, a paragon of Western civilization, has survived the German occupation. The credit for that goes to the German commander of the city, General Dietrich von Choltitz. Risking not only his life, but those of his family, Choltitz has blatantly disobeyed Hitler's orders to raze the city. Instead, he waits in his headquarters in the Hotel Meurice until Allied commanders arrive to accept his surrender. The next day, the rest of the 2nd Armored enters the city along with the Americans of General Raymond Barton's 4th Division. The GIs are greeted with no less enthusiasm than that afforded their French counterparts. It is a rather abrupt transition for the fighting men. Only the day before, they were being bloodied by German anti-tank guns on the outskirts of the city. Now, they are centerpieces of the biggest celebration the world has seen since the end of the Great War. But being young men, they quickly adjust and enthusiastically join in the revelry. Also arriving in the city on the 26th is General Charles de Gaulle, or France, as he fancies himself. He and his entourage parade through the streets as if he alone were responsible for liberating the city. It is a very calculated maneuver. In politics, perception is reality, and de Gaulle is nothing if not a savvy politician. He is well aware that his ascension to the post-war leadership of France is not yet assured. Communist factions of the resistance that were instrumental in driving the Germans from the city are equally determined to establish France as a Marxist state. De Gaulle's cavalcade down the Champs-Élysées, however, simply steals the show. Not only does it establish him in the hearts of Frenchmen as their rightful leader, it solidifies his position in the eyes of the world. Meanwhile, senior Allied commanders, including General Dwight Eisenhower, arrive to share in the celebration. Ike, however, has too many concerns to give himself fully to the spirit of the day. If fighting the Germans were not enough of a charge, he has recently found himself saddled with the burden of dealing with Le Grand Charles. In addition to his rude, arrogant, overbearing manner, de Gaulle's insistence that Paris be liberated has thrown a wrench into Schaeff's plans. The Allies' supply problems, already the weak link in their ability to prosecute the war, have been further exacerbated by the taking of the city. In fact, there is now concern that this diversion of resources may well prevent the Allies from seizing a Rhine bridgehead before winter sets in. Eisenhower's concerns, however, are mild compared to the rage emanating from Berlin. Hitler is livid that Paris has fallen into Allied hands intact. Still determined to destroy the city, he orders flights of bombers be turned against it. Those orders are never transmitted, however, as Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff of Army Group B, realizes they are simply the rantings of a madman. In Paris, amidst the festivity, the Allies begin to uncover grim reminders of the brutality of the Nazi regime. In the basement of Gestapo headquarters, they discover the torture and execution devices used to silence any enemies of the state. In the courtyard, there are bodies of resistance members executed in the final hours of the Nazi occupation, denied the joy of liberation. But this is a time for celebration. Parades down the avenues of Paris mark the culmination of what has been, by any measure, an astounding summer for the Allied cause. Not only has Hitler's vaunted fortress Europe been cracked, the Germans have been driven from the city he coveted above all others. Now, the only European capital remaining to be liberated is Berlin. September 1944, France. General Dwight Eisenhower moves his headquarters across the Channel from England and assumes command of Allied ground forces from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. It is a command Montgomery begrudgingly relinquishes. Although he respects Eisenhower's diplomatic and organizational skills, he is openly scornful of his abilities as a combat general. In fact, the German collapse in northern France has divided the Allied High Command. An increasingly acrimonious debate is growing as how best to exploit the breakout from Normandy and drive on the German frontier. Contending that the Germans are all but whipped and ready for a knockout blow, Montgomery aggressively pushes his plan for a concentrated drive by the 21st Army Group north through Belgium. Its goal would be to seize a bridgehead over the Rhine and establish a north-south pincer around the Ruhr Valley. It is no coincidence that Montgomery, humble as ever, insists he should lead this bold thrust, and in so doing win the war. It is a plan Eisenhower has no intention of accepting. Not only does he take exception to Monty's arrogant suppositions, he adamantly disagrees with his strategy. He knows that as the Allies drive east, their overwhelming logistical advantage will quickly disappear. At the same time his supply lines are lengthening, the German army will be growing closer and closer to its own strategic reserve. Any Allied army caught out on a limb without sufficient logistical support could be cut off and annihilated. Instead of a single concentrated drive on the Rhine, Eisenhower prefers a broad front approach. British and Canadian forces will still drive north through Belgium toward the Ruhr, but at the same time, Bradley's forces would target the Saar River Valley. For while the Ruhr may be the foundry of the Reich, it is coal from the Saar that fuels its fires. As Allied armies continue to pour across the Seine, it seems as though Eisenhower's concerns may be justified. Although the Germans are still undoubtedly on the run, they are in places beginning to get their feet back under them. Communication and supply lines are beginning to be re-established. Cohesion begins to set in. At the same time, the Allied support system is growing overly taxed. Every drop of gas, morsel of food, and round of ammunition for the advancing armies must still be transported to the front all the way from the beaches in Normandy and Provence. Suddenly, the whole Allied effort in Europe seems to hinge on hundreds of lowly truck drivers who push themselves to the limit to keep the flow of supplies running. Meanwhile, Montgomery continues to seethe. He is certain Eisenhower is needlessly extending the war, certain that the swift seizing of a Rhine bridgehead would bring victory by year's end. He begins to develop a plan to do just that. Eisenhower and the Americans be damned. September 1944, Latvia. Red armies launched their offensive in the Baltic states, driving toward the port city of Riga. As Katyusha rocket launchers, affectionately called Stalin's organs, pound German positions, valiant Red pilots in their IL-2 fighter bombers blast elements of the Wehrmacht's Army Group North, commanded by Colonel General Ferdinand Schörner. In the first days of the offensive, the Soviets retake much of the territory captured during a limited offensive by Army Group Center in August. The primary target of the attack is a narrow corridor between Army Group Center and Army Group North, near the Gulf of Riga, which could provide an escape route for Schörner's men. But escape is not to be. The Führer has forbidden retreat. Although they are hopelessly outnumbered, every man is ordered to fight where he stands. Despite all efforts, the Germans are simply overwhelmed. The corridor collapses and the Soviet machine rolls on. In less than a week, the center and right flanks of the German line have given way completely. In addition to the dire straits in which Army Group North finds itself, the entire German cause on the Eastern Front is beginning to crumble. Their carefully and sometimes forcefully established alliances with other countries are collapsing. The first to stray from the German fold was Romania. As elements of the Soviet army entered their territory in August, Romanian leaders quickly severed their ties with Germany. As a further insult to German pride, they quickly declared war on their former ally. The next to go was Bulgaria. As Soviet ground forces crossed over the Bulgarian border, they met only token resistance. Within days, Bulgarian leaders too declared war on Germany, and the Soviets granted an immediate armistice to the beleaguered country. In light of these crushing defeats, the Finns also bowed out of the war, finally accepting the Soviet peace accord. The defection of three key Eastern allies leaves gaping holes in the German line. Fully 20 divisions, some of which held key sectors, have been removed from the Axis order of battle. These gaps must now be filled with German troops, troops that are in short supply and great demand. To further push their advantage, the Soviets prepare to commit the Leningrad front to the fray. They are to drive east on Army Group North's left flank. If they are able to reach Narva on the northern Estonian coast, Schörner and his men will be surrounded by 4 Soviet army groups. Then, Retreat will no longer be an option. The choice will be a very simple one. Either surrender, or, as the Fuhrer would apparently have them do, die, fighting in the name of the fatherland. September 1944, the Central Pacific, Operation Stalemate 2. The clearing of the Palau Island chain starts with a very big bang indeed. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's 5 battleships, 9 cruisers, and various destroyers begin an intensive bombardment of the island of Peleliu. Major General William Rupertus, commander of the 1st Marine Division, is optimistic about the operation and predicts no more than 3 days of fighting before the small island is cleared of enemy resistance. Knowing the Japanese reputation for fighting to the last man, the general's staff is not nearly as confident. Stalemate 2 is aptly named, for it is an example of the strategic disagreements that have plagued the war in the Pacific. The Navy favors a Central Pacific drive, securing deep-water ports and airfields from which to support its massive carrier task force's strikes on Japan. The Army, particularly General Douglas MacArthur, pleads for a return to the Philippines and restoration of American honor. The decision to take or not to take the Palau Island chain went all the way to Admiral Chester Nimitz, the Pacific Theater's supreme commander. After considering all sides, Nimitz issued the order to take the Palaus. On 15 September, Rupertus Marines head for the beach. Oldendorf's battleships and destroyers throw all they have at the defenders. The Japanese respond, firing mortar rounds that fall randomly among the incoming Amtraks. The Marines, feeling their oats or perhaps their nerves, break into Give My Regards to Broadway. As the Amtraks lumber to shore and the first wave of Marines disembarks, all hell breaks loose. The singing is over. The fight is on. Facing the Marines are a mixed bag of naval and ground troops under the command of Colonel Kunio Nakagawa. They are, to a man, eager to fight and die for the Emperor. They are dug into a series of limestone cliffs, interconnecting pillboxes and caves buttressed by steel and concrete. From Mount Umbrogal, the island's highest point, machine gun and rifle fire rakes the Marines trapped on the beach. With the sea to their back and the Japanese in front, the Marines decide on a bonsai charge of their own. On a small rise overlooking the beach, over 200 men simultaneously attack the Japanese. A furious fight ensues. When the smoke clears, only 31 Americans are left to hoist the colors. The Americans have taken the small hill, but the Japanese still hold Mount Umbrogal. Navy corpsmen are shot dead while attempting to render aid. Temperatures soar to 115 degrees. The only relief is death. And unfortunately for the Marines, there is plenty of that to go around. The morning of the 16th comes hot, and the Marines try to break out of the beachhead, moving toward the island's airfield. To their surprise, the Japanese begin firing from positions secured by the Leathernecks only the day before. Crawling through tunnels beneath the advancing Marines, they move from one position to another, emerging to kill a Marine and then disappear. The Marines, frustrated, hot, and with no other options, push grimly forward. They secure the airfield by dusk. The Americans cannot afford to rest. The hardest fighting remains ahead of them. The same Marines who survived the deadly crawl across the beach now have to pry the Japanese out of their mountain caves. The fate of Stalemate 2 remains in question. What is not at issue is that the operation itself should not have been attempted at all. October 1944, Saipan. The Americans are getting closer to Japan. closer to taking the Pacific War to those who started it. Not since early April 1942, when 16 B-25s, under the command of Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, took off from the aircraft carrier Hornet on a one-time, one-way trip to Tokyo, has the island of Japan been under direct threat of U.S. bombardment. After that, Doolittle promised, "We're going back to Tokyo, and we shall go in full array." Now, with the arrival of the B-29 Superfortress and the 21st Bomber Command on Saipan, that promise is being fulfilled. The skies over Tokyo and over Japan's ports and industrial centers will again be filled with the drone of U.S. planes. Until now, the United States has had neither the plane capable of making such a long trip, nor a land base from which to operate. With production of the B-29 and capture of Saipan in the Marianas Islands 3 months ago, everything is now in place to launch regular, full-scale aerial attacks on Japan. Put quite simply, the B-29 can fly higher, faster, and farther than any plane that has come before it. Good thing, because even with the capture of Saipan, the trip to Japan and back is still 3,000 miles and takes 16 hours to complete. With its ability to fly in excess of 5,000 miles per trip, however, the Superfortress redefines the term long range. The B-29 is powered by 4 massive Pratt & Whitney Wasp engines and has a top speed exceeding 360 miles per hour. Its service ceiling is more than 6 miles above sea level. At this altitude, not only is the plane less vulnerable to attack from below, the air is very thin. But for the B-29, this poses no problem, for it is the Army Air Corps' first pressurized bomber. This allows its 14-man crew to forego the cumbersome flight gear and oxygen masks that their counterparts in other bombers wear. At 141 feet, the B-29's wingspan is longer than Wilbur Wright's first flight at Kitty Hawk. More wing can carry more weight, up to 20,000 pounds of bombs to be exact. Add flaps that constitute 1/5 of the wing's total area, and you can land the giant aircraft on a runway only 1.5 miles long. Planning for the Superfort began in the late 1930s when the Army Air Corps called for a plane that could fly a bomb load thousands of miles out to sea and return. Boeing answered with plans for the B-29, 50 tons of plans to be exact. Although they were finalized in 1940, it's been a long road to the Pacific for this revolutionary aircraft. There were problems with engine fires and skepticism on the part of the pilots who would fly this 60-ton behemoth that some describe as being similar to flying an apartment building. The first B-29s arrived in India and China last spring, but there were still design problems, and it became readily apparent that moving supplies and bombs from India to China across the Himalayas made a large-scale offensive against Japan from China impractical. Design modifications ensued, and the capture of Saipan moved the bombing line forward by 1,000 miles. The Superforts pouring off Boeing's production lines portend rough times ahead for the Japanese. They will soon find themselves in the shadow of the most devastating bomber the world has ever seen. And for the Americans, the B-29 seems to be the silver lining in the cloud of war. September 1944, England. An armada of 1,500 C-47 transports and 478 gliders carrying some 20,000 airborne troops departs for their Dutch destinations. Once over their landing zones, they disgorge their human cargo for the next 70 minutes. Unfortunately for the Allies, the Germans, while initially caught off guard, quickly recover. Colonel General Kurt von Studen's 1st Parachute Army inflicts heavy losses upon the airborne units. Gliders and their transports burst into flame from accurate and deadly anti-aircraft fire. While better known for his cautious, some would say timid approach, the architect of this daring plan is, surprisingly enough, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery pushed the plan through Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower over the objections of 12th Army Group Commander General Omar Bradley. Bradley instead advocated a thrust by General George Patton's Third Army into the more lightly defended Saar River Valley. Eisenhower, having denied Monty's schemes time and again, and with limited supplies at his disposal, decided to back the plan for the sake of Allied cooperation. Assured by Montgomery that this would end the war by Christmas, Eisenhower allotted the 1st Allied Airborne Army under the command of General Louis Brereton to carry out the airborne phase of the operation known as Market. The plan calls for the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, British 1st Airborne Division, and the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade to secure Rhine bridges along a 65-mile corridor at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. The ground portion of the operation, Garden, falls on the British 30th Corps, commanded by General Brian Horrocks, whose objective is to smash through the defenses on a narrow front and quickly relieve the lightly armed and supplied paratroops. The ultimate goal of 30th Corps is to link up with the Red Devils of the British 1st Airborne Division at the tip of the spearhead at Arnhem. There, on the east bank of the Rhine, they will be poised for further strikes into northern Germany's industrial Ruhr. The American 101st Airborne Division, commanded by General Maxwell Taylor, moves towards their assigned bridges at Grave and Saône near the town of Eindhoven. As lead elements approach the Saône River Bridge, it literally blows up in their faces, thanks to pesky German engineers. There is nothing to do but settle in and wait for the arrival of 30th Corps and hope for the best. Meanwhile, in the north, General James Gavin, in pain from a cracked spine received during the drop, leads his 82nd Airborne toward the bridge at Nijmegen. Despite stiff resistance, the veterans of Normandy push on toward their objective. The commander of the British 1st Airborne Division, General Robert Urquhart, experiences even more difficulties. The special glider train of jeeps designed to carry his division to Arnhem, some 8 miles distant, fails to arrive intact. Further complicating matters, his communications are a shambles due to faulty radios. Allied intelligence has badly underestimated the strength of the German units in and around Arnhem. Instead of facing undermanned garrison units, the British find themselves facing the might of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, comprised of the 9th and 10th SS Armored Divisions, recently moved into the area. The British have secured positions within Arnhem, allowing them to defend the north end of the bridge. Even after repeated bloody attacks, the German armor is unable to dislodge the paratroops from their well-defended outposts. Despite the heroic defense, the paratroops are in a desperate situation. Their ammunition and supplies are already running low. Their only hope is quick relief by Horrocks' 30th Corps. That, however, seems unlikely. Advancing along the Eindhoven-Arnhem Highway, the 30th stalls against determined German defenders. After some delay, rocket-firing Typhoons open the way. Realizing that every second counts, Horrocks urges his men on. The lead unit, the Irish Guards, by sheer intrepidity, battle through to Taylor's 101st Airborne, only to find the paratroops in possession of nothing more than a destroyed bridge. A Bailey Bridge is built in record time, and 30th Corps moves on, albeit behind schedule. Racing along the road the soldiers have nicknamed Hell's Highway, Horrocks' men join the 82nd in an assault on the Nijmegen Bridge. Gavin's men reach the east bank and, in a furious fight, drive the defenders from their positions. German demolition attempts fail, and Allied armor streams across the bridge. On 24 September, days behind schedule, 30th Corps comes within a few miles of Arnhem, but is halted by an unfaltering German defense. Horrified, Allied commanders can only watch as the weight of German armor ceaselessly chews up the Red Devils. By 25 September, it is clear that the battle is lost. Montgomery orders the evacuation of Urquhart's remaining men. Those left behind either surrender or are dead. The price for Hell's Highway is atrocious. Urquhart's division has been almost completely destroyed, suffering 7,000 casualties out of 10,000 men. Total Allied losses amount to 17,000 troops. While Montgomery lauds the effort of his soldiers and audaciously claims victory, it is an empty boast. Everyone in the Allied command realizes that Operation Market Garden has been an unmitigated disaster. It was the Allies' one shot at seizing a Rhine bridgehead before the onset of winter. The Germans will now have months to strengthen their west wall defenses and recuperate from their 2-month retreat through France. While acknowledging that Market Garden has been a setback and that the drive to Berlin has been temporarily halted, the Allies remain confident that with the coming of spring, they will be able to resume their steady eastward push. For now, they simply prepare to settle in for what should be a long, uneventful winter. September 1944, the Philippines. At 9:30 a.m. local time, U.S. planes appear in the skies over Manila Bay, adding the percussion of their guns and the bass of their engines to Filipino radios, music for your morning mood. U.S. Navy Avengers and Hellcats pound docks, merchant ships, warehouses, repair yards, and airfields in the Bay Area, eliciting cries from Filipinos against the brutal and merciless American devils. The Philippines is a different country from the one which President Manuel Quezon and General Douglas MacArthur were forced to leave more than 2 years ago. It is a country run by Quezon's former cronies who have allied themselves with their Asian big brother, the Japanese Empire. It is an alliance based on mutual respect of sovereignty and territory, and blatant fear of retribution should they not comply with Japanese wishes. When asked, would the sufferings of the people be greater if the Americans or if the Japanese considered us hostile, President of the independent Philippine Republic, Jose Laurel, without hesitation replied, "I prefer that the Japanese do not consider us hostile." On 23 September, Laurel, prodded by his Japanese puppeteers, boldly declares war against the United States and England. Since then, Task Force 38, under the command of Admiral Mark Mitcher, has been pounding Japanese positions throughout the Philippines. On 31 August, while a portion of Mitcher's force diverted Japanese attention with attacks on the Volcano and Bonin Islands, the bulk of his might focused on supporting the landing on Mindanao and the southern portion of the Philippine Islands. Island battles against the Japanese thus far in the war have been vicious, resulting in a high loss of life on both sides. At Mindanao, however, things were different. U.S. forces encountered ill-prepared Japanese troops who offered only faint resistance. When the smoke cleared, the Japanese had lost over 370 planes and over a dozen cargo vessels. The surprisingly easy success on Mindanao prompted 3rd Fleet Commander Admiral Bull Halsey to order Task Force 38 to sweep all the way through the islands south of Luzon. The Americans' luck continued. Obscured by a weather front, the task force approached Manila Bay undetected. By midnight on 20 September, U.S. carriers had slipped to within 70 miles of Luzon. There they launched their assault. Now, as the mood music plays, air groups from the Hornet and Wasp target shipping, while planes from the Intrepid, Bunker Hill, Essex, and the Lexington focus their attention on Clark and Nichols Fields, about 30 miles from Manila. Aerial engagements rage. For the Japanese, however, surprise and inexperience prove a deadly combination. Pilots with as little as 2 weeks' training are a little match for the seasoned Americans. Although at times outnumbered by 5 to 1, the Navy pilots ride roughshod over their adversaries, emerging from the fray virtually unscathed. At Manila and Subic Bays, 200 Japanese planes are destroyed on the ground. Dozens of ships are disabled. The cost to the Americans is 8 planes. The mission has been an enormous success. Once again, the Japanese have suffered a devastating blow and been able to do little in the way of retribution. As crew members of Halsey's flagship carrier Enterprise take time out to enjoy a movie, Halsey radios his boss, Admiral Chester Nimitz, "No damage to our surface forces, and nothing on the screen but Hedy Lamarr." September 1944, Metz. Since becoming operational on 1st August 1944, the Third Army under General George Blood and Guts Patton has taken the fight straight to and out of the Germans. In less than 2 months, the Third Army has captured over 41,000 square miles of territory, liberated over 800 cities and towns, and cost the Wehrmacht over 120,000 casualties, the vast majority being prisoners who chose surrender over death for a cause they now consider hopeless. On 25 September, Patton's army is ordered to suspend all offensive operations and to assume an aggressive defense. With his recon units probing forward to the fortress city of Metz, the key to Patton's success, mobility, is taken away as his supplies of gasoline are stripped to support the Allied drive into Belgium and Holland. That decision could not have come at a worse time. Wehrmacht commanders realized that only by retreating to the Saarland and the relative safety of the static defensive fortifications known as the West Wall can they retain any hope of re-establishing a contiguous Western Front. Patton is well aware of that fact. He believes that with adequate fuel, the Third Army could bypass the static defenses of Metz and the Maginot Line, smash into the denuded West Wall defenses, and drive for the Rhine, thus forcing the entire Wehrmacht into a general retreat to avoid being encircled and destroyed. Instead, Patton's army is now reduced to pecking operations against a near impregnable obstacle. The defenses around Metz are indeed formidable. 35 forts guard the southern approaches to the city. These forts are in turn anchored by Fort Drian, itself a chain of fortifications which bristle with artillery, moats, and automatic weapons. It is little wonder that the citizens take a special pride in claiming that the city has not been captured since Attila the Hun in 45 AD. The Germans also realize that Third Army's days of broken field running are, at least for now, ended. The importance of Metz is not lost on them. They have used the respite to recuperate and strengthen their defenses. Since Patton has never issued a defensive order to the Third Army, the aggressive defense order is officially issued from his staff. The unenviable task of probing the defenses around Metz is given to units of 20 Corps under Major General Walton Walker. Nicknamed Bulldog for both his build and his fighting disposition, Walker admires Patton to the point of emulation and takes pride that his troops have been assigned the task of taking the city. As if fighting entrenched Germans isn't enough, Third Army now has to defend itself against Mother Nature. The soldiers in Patton's divisions find themselves without wet weather gear, which has been withheld in the rear. Third Army now must slog through gigantic seas of mud on roads the consistency of chocolate cream pies. Now competing with German booby traps and time bombs are the age-old enemies of all armies: trench foot, flu, and the assorted ailments that come from being too wet, too long. Nevertheless, the probing attacks push off on time. The 90th, 83rd, and 5th Divisions, along with a task force of combat engineers and cavalry, driving from the north, encounter the expected stiff resistance. Still, the initial results are encouraging enough for one 5th Division regimental commander to recommend a frontal assault against Fort Drian. Patton's chief of staff and his G3, dead set against the plan, are overruled by the general. Preceded by a massive aerial bombardment, the 5th Division's frontal assault against Metz begins on 3 October. After a week of sharp combat, the 5th manages to penetrate the outer defenses of Fort Drian. Now fighting among corridors of concrete and steel, The battle continues as step by step the enemy positions are reduced. Although the Germans have had adequate time to prepare their defenses, the tough, lean men of the Third Army continue to press forward, confident that they will break through the gateway to the Saar and once again gain ground measured in miles, not yards. October 1944, Western Germany. For the first time since Hitler began his conquest of Europe in 1938, a German city is imperiled from Allied ground attack. U.S. ground troops have penetrated the defensive system of concrete and steel pillboxes, known to the Germans as the West Wall, and to the Allies as the Siegfried Line. General Louis Craig's U.S. 9th Infantry Division faces what promises to be a hard-fought and bitter struggle to break through the Siegfried at the Herdgen Forest. 20 miles to the north, the Americans of General Clarence Huebner's 1st Infantry Division are closing in on Aachen. The attack on the Herdgen begins with a flourish as 84 P-47 Thunderbolts bombard the forest. Giving the Germans little time to think, U.S. artillery follows with a 3-minute round of intensive shelling. Whatever momentum is established by this onslaught is quickly lost as Craig next sends in his infantry to clear the forest. The Herdgen itself is a formidable opponent. It is, notes one soldier, after conducting the initial reconnaissance into the forest, dark, foreboding, gloomy, and terrible. It is a forest primeval, so thick with evergreen trees that the only way for the infantry to maneuver through it is on its hands and knees. Its deep gorges and steep slopes meant more for goat than man. Besides the green hell of the Herdgen, the veteran German infantry stands in the Allies' way. These defenders don't seem likely to give in easily. Even before the GIs have advanced 50 yards, the Germans have them dead in their sights, and the Americans' progress slows to a snail's pace. As the infantry wades through the thick forest, casualties mount. One must wonder whether anyone in the U.S. command paid attention to the initial reports of what they faced. Already, it is obvious that the Americans have entered a military quagmire, a place where each attack is likely to be met by an equally destructive counterattack. The Herdgen Forest promises to be a battle of attrition. The ultimate victor will be the army that can hold out the longest. German real estate just got more expensive. Both sides will pay a high price in blood and lives lost before either claim this forested plot. But things look more promising for the Americans at Aachen, the ancient city of Emperor Charlemagne, where their latest offensive has been underway since 2 October. The Siegfried Line at Aachen presented a barricade to the city 12 miles deep. Hurling all the air and ground firepower they could muster, the Americans sent 432 medium bombers and fighter bombers to drop their payloads on the fortress. Next, Corps artillery threw its own barrage at the enforcement. In the end, all the flash and show was just that. The infantry and engineers would have to take on the real work of breaking the Siegfried, pillbox by pillbox. They fired machine guns and small arms into bunker apertures, blasted them with dynamite, welded doors shut, and used bulldozers to bury them. Once it had breached the Siegfried, however, the U.S. First Army found the going was no easier. Along the road to Aachen, it faced constant German counterattacks. Now, however, it is closing in on all sides of the city. Piece by piece, its plan is coming together. Break through the Siegfried Line, cut the supply roads to the city, encircle it, isolate it, watch it fall. The fall of Aachen will provide the Allies a strategic point from which to attack the Siegfried Line from behind. It will make refugees of the German people, who for the first time will see where their politicians and generals and strutting Nazi youth have led them. The fall of Aachen will make Germany vulnerable as it has not been before. 17 September 1944, Peleliu. Having secured the airfield and repelled a series of savage Japanese counterattacks, General William Rupertus, 1st Marine Division, begins the grueling task of driving the enemy from the island's interior. Pre-invasion intelligence indicated Peleliu was relatively flat and covered in jungle. In fact, the island is a series of highly angled coral ridges and ravines covered only in scrub brush. In these ridges, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa has placed some of the toughest troops in all the Imperial Army. From his command post, deep inside a sheer cliff wall, Nakagawa has given orders that there will be no savage banzai charges on Peleliu. Here they will fight a different kind of war. More than 10,000 veteran combat troops, many of whom fought at Bataan, are dug into caves and reinforced pillboxes. Immune from shell fire, they watch the Marines patiently and wait for them to come. And come they do. Because the Japanese positions are nearly impossible to detect, the Marines use flamethrowers, artillery, and naval bombardment to strip the hills of all vegetation. Into the wasteland that's left go the Marines. Each time they do, fewer and fewer return. The veteran Japanese soldiers show incredible fire discipline, choosing targets carefully and seldom giving away their positions. One Marine regiment loses all of its company commanders. An entire platoon is caught in a deadly crossfire on a remote summit and wiped out. Next, Colonel Nakagawa releases his close-order combat troops into the fray. As night falls, every night, elite Japanese sappers infiltrate American lines. Armed only with samurai swords, bayonets, and grenades, they jump into foxholes and even command posts, slashing and kicking. Sometimes they blow themselves up, along with as many Marines as they can. These nightly infiltrations actually kill very few Marines, but their long-term effect on the American morale is devastating. The line Marines fight all day, and then, because of the fear created by the infiltrators, get almost no sleep at night. In short order, the sleepless Leathernecks begin to show signs of severe exhaustion. Friendly fire accidents increase as a battle that commanders expected to last 4 days enters its 3rd week. Casualty figures continue to mount. Japanese fire rains incessantly from the craggy heights. Barren hills are taken in heated, day-long battles, only to be abandoned at night and retaken the next day. In the midst of this horrid merry-go-round, the profound hatred that burns between Marine and Imperial foot soldier, begun at Pearl Harbor and fostered on Guadalcanal, reaches new levels of intensity. Peleliu is war at its most horrific and dehumanizing. It is hot, savage, relentless combat in a state of homicidal rage, where both sides practice attrition with extreme prejudice. Day after day, the Americans assault ridges and valleys with names like Old Baldy, the Wildcat Bowl, and Death Valley. Their strategy is as simple as it is brutal. Like a huge python, the 1st Marine Division forms a ring of death around the Japanese and, gradually tightening it, forces them into a smaller and smaller area of Peleliu's interior, on the side of Mount Umbrogal. Advancing only yards on some days, the Leathernecks go about the grim business of annihilating the Japanese garrison. Having assaulted the beaches, swamps, valleys, and ridges of Peleliu for an entire month, the 1st Marine Division, minus over 5,000 wounded, dead, and missing, is finally relieved by the Wildcats of the U.S. Army 81st Division on 15 October. Under the command of Major General Paul J. Mueller, the Wildcats lay siege to the Japanese positions in the hills. Where the Marines depended on the inherent toughness and fighting spirit of the individual rifleman, the Army relies on sheer material might. Combat engineers bulldoze the coral into huge ramps so tanks and flamethrowers can drive right into the mouths of enemy caves and fire point blank. Artillery crews return Japanese rifle fire with 155mm howitzers. Driving from the north side of Umbrogal, the Wildcats establish a foothold on a desolate peak named Brother One.
Now the endgame begins. Army units illuminate the only freshwater pond at the center of the pocket, cutting off the Japanese water supply. In late November, with fewer than 100 combat troops still at his disposal, Colonel Nakagawa sends a terse message to Tokyo that he has come to the end of his ability to resist. In a quiet ceremony, Nakagawa burns the regimental colors and commits suicide. The Wildcats make a final push on the morning of 25 November, flooding into the pocket from all sides. Resistance is crushed by 10:30 a.m. At 11 a.m., General Mueller receives word from his frontline commanders that the enemy has fulfilled his determination to fight to the death. In all, the battle for Peleliu and surrounding islands has claimed the lives of more than 10,000 Imperial soldiers and 1,400 U.S. Marine and Army troops. Thousands more are wounded. Victory over this tiny dot in the vast Pacific has been achieved, but the fanatical Japanese have once again forced the victors to pay a terrible price. September 1944, England. Despite Allied successes on the continent, Hitler's vengeance weapons, the V-1 and V-2 rockets, continue to bring home brutal reminders that the war is far from over. Efforts to combat the menace have met with mixed results. The V-1 is vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire and can be caught by the RAF's new jet fighter, the Gloucester Meteor. The V-2, however, is virtually unstoppable, slamming into its targets without warning. In late August, under increasing pressure from a panicked population, Prime Minister Winston Churchill asked Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower to attend to the problem. Ike directed his irksome subordinate, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, to drive up the Channel coast, liberating the port cities and overrunning the rocket launch sites. Montgomery, in turn, assigned the task to Lieutenant General Henry Crerar's Canadian First Army and General Miles Dempsey's British Second Army. The attack kicked off on 1st September following an intense aerial bombardment. The Canadians on the left flank were given the task of securing the ports of Le Havre, Dieppe, Boulogne, and Calais, while Dempsey's troops, fighting to the right, were to drive straight for Europe's largest port, Antwerp. Initial progress was better than expected as the Allies found themselves on the heels of what amounted to disorganized rabble. The Canadians gained a measure of sweet revenge by seizing the port city of Dieppe, where Canada's best were badly bloodied in the failed landings of August 1942. Unable to outmaneuver Montgomery's forces, Hitler ordered the Wehrmacht to slow their drive by retreating to and fortifying the port cities. Reducing those defenses would take the Allies weeks, if not months, and would be a significant drain on their force. Crerar, however, had no intention of wasting time or manpower on bloody street-to-street fighting for ports that, in the larger scheme of things, would mean little to the Allied cause. Perhaps borrowing a page from the Americans' Pacific strategy, he simply bypassed the German strongholds, leaving them to wither on the vine. The advance rolled on. By 4 September, Dempsey's forces had advanced 225 miles and reached Antwerp. Expecting a tough fight, the Tommies were surprised to take the city with relative ease. This was in large measure due to the incredibly effective assistance rendered by the Belgian underground. Facing a series of blown bridges leading into the city, the British were led to an intact one a few kilometers to the east by a Belgian engineer named Robert Wykemans. Wykemans then led Dempsey's troops into the heart of the city, skirting German positions all the way. The German commander, hopelessly infiltrated by British troops, promptly surrendered the garrison. Meanwhile, the Canadians' drive continued. By the 30th, they link up with the British at Antwerp and have reduced most of the German pockets of resistance in the coastal cities. Dunkirk, the site of the dramatic rescue of the British Expeditionary Force in 1940, remains the lone German holdout. Although they now have Antwerp's crucial port facilities in their hands, it is of little use to the Allies. The seaward approaches to the port remain in German control. Dug in across the Scheldt estuary are the troops of General Kurt Student's 1st Parachute Army and General Gustav von Zangen's 15th Army. Until they can be driven from these positions, the port remains useless. Although Monty's forces have made dramatic advances, his preoccupation with Operation Market Garden has prevented him from promptly clearing the Scheldt. Eisenhower is disgusted. Not only has Market Garden proved a dismal failure, the key to the Allies' logistical problems is in their hands, yet they remain unable to open the door. October 9, 1944, Moscow. As the war rages on all fronts, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill arrives to meet Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. His primary mission is to secure Russian assurances that they will join the war in the Pacific once Hitler and his minions have been vanquished. Although imperial forces throughout the Pacific are reeling, the looming invasion of the Japanese home islands promises to be a long, drawn-out, costly affair. Commitment of the Red Army to the fray in northern China would tie down large numbers of Japanese forces on the mainland that could otherwise be used to defend against American landings. Although the war with Japan may be on center stage, there are other agendas being pursued. In fact, the conduct of the Pacific War, long ago ceded to the Americans, is not the primary focus of either Churchill or Stalin. Weighing most heavily on their minds is the fate of post-war Europe. While in public there are professions of unity and trust in the Allied camp, it is becoming increasingly clear that the post-war map of Europe will be divided between those countries embraced by the Western powers and those who remain under the boots of the Bolsheviks. Even President Roosevelt privately acknowledges that post-war Europe, indeed the world, will likely be divided into these spheres of influence. Publicly, however, he decries this system as antiquated and the seed of future conflict. His promotion of a Wilsonian system of collective security is rooted less in his belief that it is practical than in his resolve that America not again slip into international isolationism. He must convince the American people that the end of the war will bring a new era in international relations, ending centuries of self-serving alliances and power politics. Realizing that lofty goal, however, looks to be a troublesome proposition. Stalin, whose blood-stained hands are testament to his ruthless self-interest, is not likely to be swayed by the American public's moral posturing. Assurances from London that defeat of the Axis is Britain's only goal ring hollow in the ears of experienced diplomats. If Britain is unable to reestablish its far-flung colonial empire, her days as a world power are finished. It seems highly unlikely that any British politician, least of all Winston Churchill, will be willing to let that happen without a fight. So even as Roosevelt promises the dawn of a new day, Churchill and Stalin carve up Central and Eastern Europe as if it were a birthday cake. With the stroke of a pen, Bulgaria and Romania fall into the communist fold. In return, Stalin acknowledges that British interests will be dominant in Greece. Elsewhere, inter-Allied cooperation abounds. It is agreed that Yugoslavia, a country already racked by bitter ethnic divisions, will be split 50-50. Poland, however, poses a more difficult problem. The exiled Polish government in London insists on the restoration of Poland's territorial integrity at war's end. The Soviets, however, have no intention of handing over territory they have paid for in blood. Intent on securing Russia's western border, Stalin has installed in Poland a puppet regime which toes the party line, insisting that the Polish people demand Russian control. As Churchill heads for home, he is pleased with the results of the meeting. Stalin has been cordial and quick to deal, agreeing to join the war against Japan within 3 months of a German capitulation. Equally important to Churchill, however, is the bargain they have struck over Central Europe. Stalin's recognition of British interests in Greece gives the Prime Minister reason to hope that, despite dwindling military and economic relevance, he may just be able to secure Britain a position of power and prestige in the post-war world. October 1944, Yugoslavia and Greece. With the success of the Soviet summer offensive, the Balkans are ripe for liberation. Axis satellites Romania and Bulgaria not only have quit the Germans, but have also declared war on them. German theater commander General Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs, faced with a 400-mile opening on his front, must soon decide whether to evacuate Albania and Greece to prevent the isolation of his Army Group E. Weichs set 10 October as the date for the pullout. In a rare move, Hitler approved the retrograde action. Every German soldier is vitally needed for the upcoming battle in Yugoslavia. Weichs ordered air and sea transports mobilized to evacuate all but the most remote island garrisons. But time was running out. By midday of 13 October, Soviet armor was poised 6 miles south of the Yugoslav capital of Belgrade. Weichs discovered that some of his units were already cut off before the battle proper began. Army Detachment Serbia, consisting of German ad hoc units, had moved into Belgrade with orders to hold out for as long as possible. With Wehrmacht units to the east of Belgrade straining every nerve to retreat west, Army Detachment Serbia's soldiers knew that their mission was not merely one of useless sacrifice. On the night of 14 October, 3 Soviet armies, in conjunction with Marshal Tito's partisan forces, launched their assault to capture Belgrade. For 1 week, in bitter hand-to-hand fighting, the Germans are pressed back to the city center. Desperately trying to stave off overwhelming odds, the German commander rejects the Soviet ultimatum to surrender. On 16 October, German resistance is crushed. The defense of Belgrade has cost the Wehrmacht 15,000 dead. The following day, the port of Dubrovnik and the city of Niš fall to Tito's partisans. With these losses, the most direct route for the evacuation of Army Group E out of Greece has been cut. Additionally, Weichs is faced with another 120-mile gap with no soldiers to fill it, and no prospect of reinforcements in the foreseeable future. Still, Weichs' prior planning has enabled Army Group E to organize an orderly retreat. Here, too, luck aids the Germans. The Balkan Air Force, consisting of 8 squadrons of aircraft, which had been harrying the Germans in Yugoslavia, now switches operations to southern Greece in support of the British landings there. On 13 October, a British expeditionary force under General Ronald Scobie began full-scale landings and a cautious advance up the Greek mainland. Against scant German resistance, British troops liberate Athens, the cradle of democracy. By 17 October, the Greek government in exile returns to power, signaling the beginning of the end of the 3.5-year Axis occupation of its homeland. But now, confusion reigns supreme. It seems that left-wing and communist factions of the Greek underground believed the Soviet army would be liberating their country. Apparently, they didn't get the word that Uncle Joe Stalin had decided to concede Greece as a present to the British in return for bigger prizes in Eastern Europe. Now the issues that the guerrilla bands fought for will need to be addressed by newly installed Prime Minister Emanuel Tsuderos. By the end of October, the last German soldier to escape crosses into Yugoslavia, leaving behind some 45,000 men still garrisoned on Aegean islands. More than a third of those abandoned are Italian soldiers, whose position or politics make no allowances for defection.